The origins of Carthage do not begin on the shores of North Africa, but rather within the crucible of Phoenician civilization, a loose confederation of fiercely independent city-states, nestled along the narrow coastal plain of the Levant. Hemmed in by the formidable Lebanon Mountains to the east and the vast Mediterranean Sea to the west, these Canaanite peoples were compelled by their geography to turn their gaze outward. Limited arable land made large-scale agriculture untenable, forcing them to harvest the sea for their prosperity. Among these city-states Byblos, Sidon, Beirut one rose to unparalleled prominence: Tyre. Its strategic advantage was twofold, comprising both a mainland settlement and a heavily fortified island citadel just offshore, a feature that made it nearly impregnable to land-based armies. Tyre possessed two natural harbours, the Sidonian harbour to the north and the Egyptian harbour to the south, which provided safe anchorage regardless of seasonal winds and allowed its fleets to operate year-round, an essential capability for a society built on maritime commerce. This relentless focus on the sea drove remarkable technological innovation. The Phoenicians perfected the art of shipbuilding, utilizing the famed cedars of Lebanon to construct durable, deep-hulled merchant vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo over long distances. Militarily, they developed the Bahrain, a warship with two tiers of oarsmen that offered a revolutionary advantage in speed and maneuverability, allowing them to protect their vital trade routes from piracy and rival powers. Perhaps their most significant maritime skill was the mastery of celestial navigation. While other ancient mariners cautiously hugged the coastlines, the Tyrians learned to navigate by the stars, particularly Polaris, which they termed the Phoenician star. This knowledge unlocked the open sea, enabling them to make direct voyages across vast stretches of water, shortening travel times and opening up previously inaccessible markets. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Their commercial empire was built upon a portfolio of valuable goods. They became renowned producers of fine textiles, intricate metalwork, and the ancient world's first transparent glass. However, their most famous and lucrative monopoly was the production of Tyrian purple, a vibrant and colour-fast dye painstakingly extracted from the glands of thousands of murex sea snails. The immense labour required to produce even a small amount of this dye made it a symbol of royalty and immense wealth, commanding exorbitant prices from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Yet, the true genius of the Phoenician economic model was its role as the central intermediary of the ancient world. Their ships transported tin from the distant British Isles, silver from the Iberian Peninsula, copper from Cyprus, and ivory from Africa, connecting disparate resource zones into a single, cohesive economic network. This commercial expansion drove the establishment of colonies not as territorial conquests, but as strategic trading posts, or emporia, designed to secure access to raw materials and dominate key sea lanes. It was this specific heritage of maritime engineering, expert navigation, high-value trade monopolies, and commercially driven colonization that would be directly inherited by its greatest colony, providing the foundational DNA for the rise of Carthage. The foundation of Carthage is enshrined in a potent political legend, a narrative recorded not by the Carthaginians themselves, whose literature is largely lost, but by their Greek and Roman contemporaries, most notably the historian Timaeus, and later Virgil in his Aeneid. While embellished, this account provides the essential charter myth that defined the city's identity. The story begins in Tyre, not with maritime commerce, but with a dynastic crisis. Upon the death of King Matan I, the throne was left to his young son Pygmalion and his daughter Elissa, who would become known to history as Dido. Elissa was married to her uncle Acerbus, a man of immense wealth, who also held the powerful position of high priest of Melkart, the patron deity of Tyre. Pygmalion, consumed by avarice and jealousy of the priest's influence, committed a profound act of sacrilege by murdering Acerbus at the temple altar. He successfully concealed the crime from his sister, hoping to seize her inheritance. The truth was revealed to Alyssa through supernatural means. The ghost of her murdered husband appeared to her in a dream, exposing Pygmalion's treachery and revealing the location of his vast hidden treasures. Acerbus's spirit urged her to flee the city to save her own life and preserve their fortune from her brother's grasp. Acting with swift and calculated intelligence, Alyssa rallied a faction of Tyrian senators who were also disaffected with Pygmalion's tyrannical rule. To orchestrate their escape, she devised a cunning ruse. Announcing her intention to move into Pygmalion's palace, she had his servants load her ships with what appeared to be her possessions, but were in fact sacks filled with sand. In full view of the king's men, she performed a ceremony, casting the sacks into the harbour as a great offering to her husband's spirit. Convinced that the treasure was now lost to the sea, Pygmalion allowed his sister to depart. Under the cover of night, Alyssa and her followers loaded the real treasure and set sail from Tyre, embarking on a self-imposed exile. Their first stop was Cyprus, where they gathered more followers and, according to the historian Justin, took aboard 80 temple maidens to provide wives for the Tyrian colonists, ensuring the new settlement's future. From Cyprus, they sailed westward, seeking a suitable location to establish a new home. They ultimately made landfall on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, in a bay protected by a large peninsula that offered an ideal natural harbour and a defensible position. Here, Alyssa entered into negotiations with the local Berber chieftain for a grant of land. The famous bargain was struck. She could purchase as much territory as could be encompassed by a single ox hide. In a display of Phoenician cleverness, Alyssa had the ox hide cut into a single, continuous, thread-like strip. This incredibly long filament was used to encircle a strategic hill overlooking the sea, a place that would become the Byrsa, the citadel and heart of the new settlement. This was the birth of Carthage, a name meaning new city in the Phoenician tongue. The act itself was symbolic, establishing a city founded not on military conquest, but on intellect, negotiation, and commercial acumen, the very traits that would define the Carthaginian Republic for centuries. Moving from the realm of foundation myths to the tangible evidence unearthed by archaeology, the story of early Carthage finds concrete, albeit complex, confirmation. While the literary tradition, primarily through the Greek historian Timaeus, places the city's founding at a precise 814 BCE, the spade of the archaeologist tells a slightly different story. The earliest layers of settlement, identified through systematic excavation on the Byrsa Hill, consistently yield pottery and artifacts dating to the middle of the 8th century BCE, around 760 BCE. This chronological discrepancy does not invalidate the Dido legend so much as it refines it, suggesting the traditional date may have marked an initial agreement or a small preliminary trading post, with the main colonial settlement emerging a generation or two later. The material culture from these nascent strata is overwhelmingly Levantine in character, affirming the city's Tyrian parentage. The most common ceramic finds are the distinctive Phoenician red slipwares, particularly plates and jugs, identical in form and fabric to those found in Tyre itself. This demonstrates a direct and continuous material link with the mother city during the initial phase of colonization. The layout of this first settlement reveals a meticulously planned enterprise, not the haphazard growth of a refugee camp. Even in its earliest phase, the city exhibited a nascent grid plan, a feature of urban design that points to a deliberate and organized founding. Early dwellings were modest, typically rectangular structures with stone foundations and mud brick walls, built for function rather than grandeur. This pragmatism suggests the initial colonists were focused on establishing a secure and commercially viable foothold. Evidence of early industry is present in the form of metallurgical workshops for bronze and iron, essential for producing tools, weapons, and articles for trade with the indigenous Berber populations. Early burial sites, located outside the main settlement area, as was Phoenician custom, provide further insight into the colonists' identity. The predominant rite in the 8th century BCE was cremation, with the ashes of the deceased placed in terracotta urns. These urns were then deposited in simple pit graves, often accompanied by a small assemblage of personal items, a few ceramic vessels for offerings, a piece of jewelry, or an amulet. These grave goods show a strong Egyptian influence, a common feature throughout the Phoenician world, with faience beads and scarab amulets appearing frequently, likely acquired through the extensive trade networks that linked the Levant to the Nile Valley. The material record also reveals that Carthage was, from its inception, a node in a wider Mediterranean network. Almost immediately, imported Greek pottery, especially high-quality Proto-Corinthian Arab alloy used for holding perfumes, begins to appear alongside the Phoenician wares. This indicates that the new city did not exist in isolation, but quickly integrated itself into the bustling commercial traffic of the central Mediterranean, setting the stage for its future as a dominant mercantile power. No feature of Carthaginian civilization has generated more intense debate or visceral horror than the sacred precinct known as the Tophet. Discovered in 1921 in the Salambo district of the city, this open-air sanctuary provides the most direct and most disturbing window into the heart of Punic religious practice. Archaeologically, the site is characterized by successive layers of urns, deposited over a period of nearly 600 years, from the city's founding until its final destruction. These terracotta jars contain the cremated remains of human infants, primarily newborns, alongside the remains of young animals such as lambs and kids. Buried with the urns are thousands of stone stelae, carved stone slabs that serve as votive monuments. The principal deities invoked in the inscriptions on these stelae are the divine couple who presided over Carthage: Baal Hammon, a formidable weather and fertility god often equated by the Romans with Saturn, and Tanit, a celestial warrior goddess whose symbol, a triangle topped with a horizontal bar and a circle, became the city's own emblem. The interpretation of these remains is the central controversy of Carthaginian history. One school of thought, heavily supported by a chorus of hostile Greco-Roman writers like Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, as well as condemnations of similar Canaanite practices in the Hebrew Bible, holds that the Tophet was a site of systematic child sacrifice. According to this view, the city's elite families would offer their firstborn children to Baal Hammon and Tanit, particularly during times of grave crisis such as famine, plague, or military invasion, to appease the gods and secure the city's salvation. The inscriptions on the stelae, which often read as a vow fulfilled in exchange for divine favor, are cited as evidence of this transactional offering. This interpretation paints a picture of a grim and deeply alien religious worldview, one that Carthage's enemies used to great effect in their propaganda. A contrasting theory, advanced by scholars who question the reliability of accounts written by Carthage's rivals, posits that the Tophet was not a place of sacrifice, but a specialized necropolis. It was a consecrated burial ground for stillborn infants and children who died of natural causes in the perinatal period, before they were considered fully integrated members of the community. In an era of extremely high infant mortality, such a cemetery would have been a demographic necessity. In this interpretation, the cremated remains represent beloved children given a sacred burial, and the stelae are memorials from grieving parents who offered an expensive dedication to commend their child's spirit to the gods and perhaps to petition for the blessing of future healthy offspring. The frequent presence of animal remains is explained as either a substitute offering for a child who survived a difficult birth or a co-offering made in grief. Osteological analysis of the bone fragments has been inconclusive, unable to definitively distinguish between sacrificial victims and natural deaths. Thus, the Tophet remains an enigma, its thousands of silent urns testifying to a profound religious ritual whose true nature, whether a loving memorial or a terrifying sacrifice, is lost to history. Following the initial period of settlement, Carthage underwent a profound political transformation, evolving from its monarchical Phoenician origins into a complex and stable oligarchy. The end of the nascent monarchy symbolized by the legendary death of its founding queen, did not lead to chaos, but to the systematic construction of a republic uniquely suited to a mercantile state. Supreme authority was not vested in a single individual or a popular assembly, but in a powerful council of elders, often referred to by Roman writers as the Carthaginian Senate. This body, composed of several hundred of the city's wealthiest and most influential citizens, likely held their positions for life, ensuring a remarkable degree of policy continuity. Membership was dominated by the great merchant families whose fortunes were inextricably linked with the fate of the state. This council functioned as the central nervous system of the Republic, deliberating on all matters of high policy, from foreign relations and the declaration of war, to the management of state finances and the appointment of generals to lead Carthage's armies. At the apex of the civic administration were two chief magistrates, known as suffates, a title derived from the Semitic root for judge, shofet in Hebrew. These officials were elected annually and functioned not as military commanders, but as the supreme civil and judicial authorities, presiding over the council of elders and acting as the city's chief judges. Their dual and time-limited nature was a deliberate constitutional design intended to prevent the concentration of executive power in a single individual, a clear departure from the model of hereditary kingship. The true locus of power, however, remained with the aristocratic council, which guided the suffet's decisions and set the long-term strategic agenda for the Republic. To further safeguard against the rise of a military strongman, a crucial concern for a state that often relied on mercenary armies led by its own citizens, the Carthaginians developed powerful institutional checks. The most formidable of these was the Tribunal of 104. This body of judges, selected from the Council of Elders, acted as a supreme court with the power to review the conduct of returning generals and other high officials. Fear of its scrutiny and its power to impose severe penalties, including crucifixion, ensured that even the most successful military leaders remained subordinate to the civil authority of the state. While a popular assembly of citizens did exist, its role was constitutionally limited. It was typically convened only to ratify decisions already made by the council, or to break a deadlock between the suffates and the elders. This entire political structure was engineered to promote stability and serve the interests of a commercial empire, where predictable governance and the protection of maritime trade routes were the paramount objectives of the state. Political influence was a direct function of wealth, creating a durable plutocracy that governed Carthage for most of its history. The middle of the 6th century BCE marks a pivotal transition in Carthaginian history, witnessing the rise of the Magonid dynasty and the city's first concerted efforts at territorial imperialism. Under the leadership of Mago I, who came to prominence around 550 BCE, Carthage began to pivot from a purely commercial hegemon into a military power intent on securing direct control over key resources and territories. Mago and his successors, primarily his sons Hasdrubal I and Hamilcar I, initiated a series of fundamental military reforms that laid the groundwork for this expansion. They professionalized the army, moving away from unreliable citizen levies and toward the large-scale systematic recruitment of mercenaries from across the western Mediterranean. Libyans, Iberians, and Celts, all placed under the command of Carthaginian generals. This created a formidable and permanent military instrument directly answerable to the state, or more precisely, to the family that commanded it. The Magonids effectively established themselves as the preeminent military and political family in Carthage for over a century, holding the most important generalships and influencing the Council of Elders' foreign policy agenda. Their primary strategic objective became the island of Sardinia. Its importance to Carthage was multifaceted. The island possessed exceptionally fertile coastal plains, making it a potential breadbasket to feed Carthage's growing urban population, and its mountainous interior was rich in mineral wealth, particularly silver and lead. Securing Sardinia would also deny its strategic harbours to Greek rivals, especially the Phocians, who were aggressively expanding their own commercial networks. However, the conquest was no simple matter. The island was home to the indigenous Nuragic civilization, a resilient Bronze Age culture famous for its thousands of stone towers, or nuragi. These people were fierce warriors with a long history of resisting foreign encroachment, and they would not yield their ancestral lands easily. The Magonid campaigns in Sardinia, beginning under Mago I and continuing under Hasdrubal I, were a protracted and bloody affair. Rather than a swift conquest, it was a grinding war of attrition that spanned decades. The Carthaginians established and reinforced their coastal footholds at cities like Sulcis and Tharos, using them as beachheads for campaigns into the interior. The advance into the Campidano Plain and other agricultural lowlands was met with fierce guerrilla resistance from the Nuragic tribes, who used their intimate knowledge of the rugged, mountainous terrain to their advantage. Carthaginian losses were often severe. Hasdrubal I himself was mortally wounded during one of these campaigns. Over time, however, the superior organization, resources, and logistical capacity of the Punic army allowed them to gradually secure the most valuable parts of the island. By the early 5th century BCE, the Magonids had established firm control over Sardinia's plains and mining districts, effectively transforming it into Carthage's first and most important overseas province, even as Nuragic resistance smouldered in the highlands for centuries to come. The foundation of Carthage's dominion over the western Mediterranean was not its armies, but its navy, an institution supported by one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, the Kothon. This massive, artificially constructed double harbour was the heart of Carthaginian maritime power, a testament to sophisticated hydraulic engineering and strategic foresight. The harbour complex consisted of two distinct but interconnected basins, meticulously excavated and lined with stone. The outer harbour was a large, rectangular basin dedicated to commercial shipping, capable of accommodating hundreds of merchant vessels and equipped with extensive quays and warehouses for the loading and unloading of cargo. This bustling port was the public face of Carthage's mercantile empire, a hub of international trade that connected the city to every corner of the known world. Its open accessibility facilitated commerce, but deliberately masked the true source of Carthage's naval strength, which lay concealed behind it. The genius of the design was the inner military harbour, a circular basin located directly behind the commercial port and accessible only through a narrow, easily defensible channel leading from it. This circular Kothon was a state secret of the highest order, its activities and true capacity hidden from the view of visiting merchants and foreign spies by a high double wall. At the centre of this circular basin was an artificial island, upon which stood the admiral's headquarters. From this central command post, the naval leadership could oversee the entire military fleet at a glance. Radiating out from this island were covered ship sheds, or slips, carved into the quayside. According to the historian Appian, there were 220 of these slips, each designed to house a warship, protecting the vessel from the elements and allowing for maintenance and repairs to be conducted in secrecy. The primary warship housed in these slips was the Quinquereme, a galley that represented the cutting edge of naval technology. These vessels were not necessarily faster than the older triremes, but were significantly larger and heavier, acting as floating artillery platforms designed to ram and sink enemy ships. Carthage's true naval advantage, however, was industrial. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Carthaginians pioneered the mass production of standardized, prefabricated ship components. This system allowed them to construct and repair their fleet with unparalleled speed, an industrial capacity that could replace combat losses at a rate their rivals could not match. The Kothon was more than just a harbour. It was a vast, integrated naval base, a factory for sea power that combined strategic security, logistical efficiency, and advanced manufacturing to create and sustain the fleet that guaranteed Carthage's empire. With its naval supremacy firmly established, Carthage systematically converted the western Mediterranean into a Punic lake, not through widespread colonization, but through the meticulous construction of a vast and jealously guarded commercial network. This was not an empire of settlement, but an empire of trade, built upon a series of strategically placed coastal trading posts, or emporia. that funneled the raw wealth of continents into the city's coffers. The primary engine of this expansion was the insatiable demand for metals. Carthaginian merchants established a near monopoly over the silver mines of southern Iberia, particularly in the region around Gades, modern Cadiz, which produced a staggering volume of bullion that underwrote the state's finances and its ability to pay its mercenary armies. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Punic mariners pushed northwards, following coastlines to the tin-rich regions of northwestern Iberia and possibly as far as Cornwall in Britain. Tin was a strategic commodity of immense value, being the essential alloy for the production of bronze, and Carthage's control over its supply routes gave it significant leverage over its rivals. Simultaneously, Carthaginian enterprise pushed southward along the Atlantic coast of Africa. The famous periplus of Hanno the Navigator, a surviving Greek translation of a Punic inscription, documents a major expedition that established a chain of colonies and trading stations along the Moroccan littoral, and perhaps ventured as far south as Sierra Leone. From these outposts, Carthage accessed the trans-Saharan trade routes, acquiring gold, ivory, exotic animal hides, and enslaved peoples from the interior of West Africa. Within the Mediterranean, the Balearic Islands were secured for their production of a potent resin and as a source of elite slingers for Carthage's armies. The agricultural output from Sardinia and parts of Sicily provided the grain necessary to feed the metropolis, freeing its own North African hinterland for the cultivation of cash crops like olives and grapes for wine production. In exchange for these raw materials, Carthaginian workshops mass-produced a range of manufactured goods for export. These were not typically high-art luxury items, but practical, well-made products. Brightly coloured textiles, simple glass beads and pendants, and vast quantities of standardized pottery. This trade was ruthlessly protected. Foreign ships found sailing in waters Carthage considered its own were often sunk without warning, a policy that effectively closed the Strait of Gibraltar to non-Punic shipping for centuries. This aggressive enforcement of trade monopolies, combined with a sophisticated network of emporia and treaties with local chieftains, formed the economic bedrock of Carthaginian power, making the city the undisputed commercial master of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage's ventures beyond the Pillars of Hercules into sub-Saharan Africa were defined by a unique and highly effective method of exchange known as the silent trade, described in detail by the Greek historian Herodotus. This practice was a sophisticated solution to the challenges of trading with indigenous peoples across immense linguistic and cultural divides. The protocol was precise and ritualized. Upon reaching a designated trading location on the coast, Carthaginian sailors would unload their manufactured goods, textiles, pottery, and glass trinkets onto the beach, arrange them neatly, and then retreat to their ships, raising a column of smoke as a signal. The local tribes, observing the smoke, would then approach the shore, inspect the offered merchandise, and place a quantity of gold dust next to the items they wished to purchase before withdrawing. The Carthaginians would return to shore. If they were satisfied with the amount of gold, they would take it and leave, concluding the transaction. If not, they would return to their ships without touching anything, signaling their desire for a better offer. This back-and-forth process, conducted without a single word exchanged, continued until both parties agreed on the terms. This system minimized the potential for conflict and built a foundation of trust that enabled a stable, long-term commercial relationship. This trade was not left to chance, but was supported by large, state-sponsored expeditions designed to establish permanent points of contact. The most famous of these was the voyage of Hanno the Navigator around 500 BCE. The surviving account of his journey, the Periplus of Hanno, describes an immense undertaking, reputedly involving 60 quinqueremes and thousands of settlers. Hanno's primary mission was to found a series of Punic colonies or trading posts along the Atlantic coast to secure and systematize the flow of African resources. His fleet sailed south, establishing settlements like Thymiaterion and Karakantakos. The expedition encountered various indigenous peoples, including the Lixatai, a friendly tribe whose members were taken on as interpreters. Further south, the voyage encountered more fantastic phenomena, including what was described as a river of fire, and an island populated by what the interpreters called guerrillae, described as hairy, savage people, likely a first European encounter with great apes. After capturing several of these guerrillae, logistical challenges, particularly dwindling provisions, forced Hanno to turn back, but not before he had dramatically expanded Carthage's knowledge of the West African coast and secured the trade routes that would supply the city with gold and ivory for generations. Carthage's westward commercial expansion inevitably brought it into direct competition with another great maritime power, the Greeks. Specifically, the network of powerful and wealthy city-states, or polius, that had colonized southern Italy and Sicily in a region known as Magna Graecia. This encounter was not one of discovery, but of escalating commercial and territorial rivalry. For centuries, a tense equilibrium had existed, with Punic traders and Greek colonists operating in overlapping spheres. The primary flashpoint for this conflict was the island of Sicily, a geopolitical linchpin whose fertile plains and strategic position astride the central Mediterranean shipping lanes made it irresistibly valuable to both powers. The Greeks, led by powerful cities like Syracuse, Acragas, and Gela, dominated the eastern and southern coasts, while Carthage had established a firm foothold in the west, with strongholds at Motia, Panormus, and Soluntum, and alliances with the indigenous Illyrmian and Sicanian peoples. The initial interactions were predominantly commercial. Carthaginian and Greek merchants competed fiercely in the markets of Etruria and central Italy, each seeking to control the flow of metals and manufactured goods. This economic friction, however, steadily escalated into political and military tension. The core difference between the two powers lay in their approach to expansion. The Greeks were colonizers, establishing permanent, agriculturally based settlements, populated by their own citizens, which inexorably expanded their territorial footprint. Carthage, by contrast, preferred to control territory through a network of trading posts and alliances, garrisoned by mercenaries, and focused on economic extraction rather than demographic settlement. This fundamental clash of systems came to a head in the early 5th century BCE. The Greek city of Selinus, located on the southwest coast of Sicily, began aggressively expanding its territory westward, encroaching on lands claimed by the Illyrmians of Segesta, a key Carthaginian ally. Segesta's appeal for aid provided Carthage with a casus belli. Simultaneously, the powerful tyrant of Syracuse, Gelon, was consolidating Greek power across the island, posing a direct threat to the Punic enclaves. These rising tensions were not limited to Sicily. Carthage's traditional alliance with the Etruscans was also aimed at containing Greek influence, both from Magna Graecia and from the powerful Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille, in southern Gaul, which challenged Punic dominance over the trade routes to Iberia. This complex web of alliances and rivalries transformed Sicily into a powder keg, setting the stage for the first of the Great Sicilian Wars, a century-and-a-half-long struggle that would pit two of the ancient world's most formidable military and economic powers against each other for control of the island and the western Mediterranean itself. The escalating tensions in Sicily culminated in 480 BCE with Carthage launching a massive military expedition, marking the formal beginning of the First Sicilian War. This was not a punitive raid, but a full-scale invasion aimed at decisively breaking Greek power on the island. The operation was placed under the command of Hamilcar of the Magonid dynasty, who assembled an enormous mercenary army, reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands. Drawn from across Carthage's sphere of influence, Libyans, Iberians, Ligurians, and Sardinians, supported by a war fleet of over 200 quinqueremes and numerous transport ships. The timing of this invasion, coinciding exactly with Xerxes' Persian invasion of mainland Greece, has led both ancient and modern historians to speculate about a coordinated Punic-Persian alliance to extinguish Greek civilization on two fronts, though concrete evidence for such a pact remains elusive. Hamilcar's force landed at Panormus, modern Palermo, and marched east to lay siege to the city of Himera, whose deposed tyrant, Terillus, was a Carthaginian ally. The strategic objective was to restore Terillus and create a client state that would shatter the Greek coalition being built by Gelon of Syracuse and his ally, Theron of Acragas. In response, Gelon marched his own formidable army, composed primarily of citizen hoplites and supported by a strong cavalry contingent, to relieve the siege. The two largest armies ever assembled in the western Mediterranean met outside Himera in a confrontation that would decide the fate of Sicily for generations. The battle itself was a tactical masterpiece by Gelon and a catastrophic disaster for Carthage. According to Greek accounts, Syracusan cavalry, possibly disguised as reinforcements from the allied Greek city of Selinus, gained entry to the Carthaginian camp and launched a surprise attack, setting fire to the Punic ships beached nearby and killing Hamilcar Mago as he was conducting a religious sacrifice. The main Greek hoplite force then launched a frontal assault on the disorganized and demoralized Carthaginian army. The result was a near-total annihilation of the Punic expeditionary force. The defeat was absolute. The army was destroyed, the fleet was burned, and Carthage was forced to sue for peace. The terms were harsh, involving a massive war indemnity of 2,000 silver talents. The political fallout in Carthage was immense, leading to the collapse of Magonid authority and accelerating the state's transition toward a more purely oligarchic republic. For over 70 years, Carthage would refrain from major military intervention in Sicily, ceding dominance of the island to a triumphant Syracuse. The 70-year hiatus in major Carthaginian military action following the disaster at Himera allowed for the consolidation of Greek power in Sicily under the undisputed hegemony of Syracuse. Victorious under Gelon, the city-state entered a golden age, first under the Dinominid dynasty of tyrants and later as a radical democracy. This period of Syracusan ascendancy was marked by aggressive expansionism. The city subjugated its Greek rivals, suppressed native Sicilian revolts, and established itself as the preeminent military and economic force in the western Mediterranean. However, this imperial ambition created an inherently unstable political environment. The old rivalries that had first drawn Carthage into Sicilian affairs did not disappear. The Elymian city of Segesta, a steadfast Carthaginian ally, found itself once again threatened by the westward expansion of its aggressive Greek neighbour, Selinus. In 415 BCE, this perennial border dispute prompted Segesta to appeal to Athens for aid, triggering the disastrous Athenian expedition. While Syracuse ultimately emerged victorious from that conflict in 413 BCE, the war left it militarily exhausted and politically strained. Seizing the opportunity, Selinus renewed its attacks on Segesta with even greater intensity. With Athens defeated and Syracuse weakened, Segesta turned to its traditional protector, Carthage. This time, the appeal fell on receptive ears. The Carthaginian Republic, having undergone significant political and military reforms since the Magonid era, saw a strategic opening. The Council of Elders sanctioned a new expedition, not merely to aid an ally, but to reclaim Carthage's lost prestige and shatter Syracuse's dominance. Command of this new enterprise was given to Hannibal Mago, the grandson of the Hamilcar who had perished at Himera. For him, the mission was one of both state policy and dynastic vengeance. In 409 BCE, Hannibal landed on Sicily with a technologically superior and tactically advanced army. This was not the force of 480 BCE. It now included sophisticated siege engines, such as towers and battering rams, and a more disciplined mercenary corps. His first target was Selinus. The city, overconfident in its own strength and expecting a slow response, was taken by storm after a short siege and ruthlessly sacked. Hannibal then marched his victorious army to Himera, the site of his grandfather's humiliation. After a brutal assault, Himera was captured and systematically destroyed. According to historical accounts, Hannibal personally oversaw the torture and execution of 3,000 Greek prisoners on the very spot where Hamilcar had died. This calculated act of retribution announced Carthage's violent return to Sicilian affairs and set the stage for a new, far more protracted conflict with the emerging power of Syracuse under its new tyrant, Dionysius I. The Carthaginian expeditionary force that landed at Lilybaeum in 409 BCE under Hannibal Mago was a testament to the Republic's renewed military ambitions and organizational capacity. Numbering an estimated 50,000 to 60,000 men, the army was a multinational mercenary force, a hallmark of Punic warfare. The corps consisted of Libyan heavy infantry, supplemented by formidable Iberian warriors famed for their ferocity and swordsmanship, slingers from the Balearic Islands whose accuracy was legendary, and contingents of Campanian cavalry. Critically, this army was supported by a dedicated corps of engineers and a formidable siege train, including massive six-wheeled siege towers and powerful battering rams. Technologies Carthage had refined through contact with the Near East and was now introducing to Sicilian warfare on an unprecedented scale. Hannibal Mago's primary objective was the swift neutralization of Selinus, the Greek city whose aggression against Segesta had precipitated the conflict. The Selinuntines, arrogant from decades of regional dominance and contemptuous of Carthage's past military failures, were catastrophically unprepared. They anticipated a long, drawn-out campaign and expected their calls for aid to Syracuse and Acragas to be answered long before any real threat materialized. Hannibal gave them no such time. Bypassing diplomatic overtures, he marched directly on the city and immediately began the assault. His engineers deployed the siege towers and rams with shocking speed, concentrating their efforts on the northern walls. The attack was relentless. For 9 days, Carthaginian forces assaulted the fortification. The Greek defenders fought with desperation, but their traditional hoplite tactics were ill-suited to defending against a technologically superior siege. The massive rams breached the walls, and the mercenary army poured into the city. What followed was not a capture, but a systematic sack of unimaginable brutality, intended to send an unequivocal message to the Greeks of Sicily. Ancient sources report that for days the Punic soldiers engaged in uncontrolled slaughter, pillage, and destruction. Diodorus Siculus claims that 16,000 inhabitants were killed and another 5,000 enslaved. The city's famed temples were looted and desecrated. The speed and savagery of the attack stunned Magna Graecia. By the time a small advance force from Syracuse arrived, Selinus had already fallen and been reduced to a smouldering ruin. Hannibal's victory was total, achieving its military objective while also serving as a terrifying demonstration of Carthage's resurgence. The shockwaves from the destruction of Selinus and Himera directly precipitated the rise of Dionysius I as tyrant of Syracuse in 405 BCE. A ruthless and ambitious military commander, Dionysius consolidated power by arguing that only a centralized autocratic state could counter the existential threat posed by Carthage. He immediately embarked on a radical and unprecedented program of military reform, transforming the nature of Hellenistic warfare. Recognizing that traditional hoplite armies were inadequate against Punic siegecraft, he invested state resources in military research and development on a massive scale. His engineers, recruited from across the Greek world, are credited with the first organized application of artillery in warfare, developing the gastrophetes, or belly bow, a powerful crossbow that could pierce armor at range, and pioneering early forms of torsion catapults. Dionysius also initiated a naval arms race, commissioning the construction of the first quinqueremes warships with 5 banks of oarsmen to create a fleet that could overpower Carthage's formidable navy. He professionalized the army, abandoning reliance on a citizen militia in favor of a large, well-paid mercenary force loyal only to him. After years of preparation, Dionysius launched his great counteroffensive in 398 BCE. His primary target was the island fortress of Motia, Carthage's most important strategic base in western Sicily. Motia was considered nearly impregnable, situated on an island in a shallow lagoon and connected to the mainland only by a narrow, easily defensible causeway. Dionysius brought the full force of his new military machine to bear. His engineers constructed a massive mole, a remarkable feat of ancient engineering, to bridge the lagoon and allow his siege engines to approach the city walls. For the first time in a major siege, catapults were used systematically to provide covering fire, suppressing defenders on the battlements and allowing his massive 6-story siege towers to be rolled into position. The Mottians, aided by the Carthaginian general Himilco, put up a fierce resistance, but they were overwhelmed by the technological superiority and sheer scale of the Syracusan assault. After breaching the walls, Dionysius's army engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting. The city was eventually taken, and, in a deliberate act of retribution for the sack of Greek cities, its Punic population was massacred or enslaved. The fall of Motia was a landmark event in military history. It was a stunning reversal of Carthaginian fortunes, demonstrating that Greek military innovation could surpass Punic technological advantages. The siege showcased the devastating effectiveness of combined arms tactics and siege artillery, setting a new standard for Hellenistic warfare and ensuring that the Sicilian Wars would continue as a high-stakes conflict between two evolving military superpowers. The fall of Motia in 398 BCE, while a significant victory for Dionysius I, did not end the war, but instead triggered a powerful Carthaginian counteroffensive. Carthage dispatched a new, massive army under the command of General Himilco, who landed in Sicily in 397 BCE and immediately seized the strategic initiative. Himilco did not attempt a direct assault to recapture the ruins of Motia. Instead, he systematically retook Punic cities, captured the Greek city of Messana, and marched his army of over 50,000 men east to lay siege to Syracuse itself. For a time, it appeared that Dionysius's great war machine would be broken and Syracuse would fall. However, the Carthaginian camp, situated in the marshy lowlands near the Anapus River, became the epicenter of a devastating pestilence, likely a form of bubonic plague. The epidemic ravaged Himilco's army, rendering his formidable force combat ineffective. Unable to maintain the siege, Himilco was forced into a humiliating retreat, abandoning the majority of his mercenary troops and returning to Carthage in disgrace. This catastrophic failure, caused by disease rather than military defeat, created a prolonged and costly stalemate. For the next several decades, neither Carthage nor Syracuse could deliver a decisive blow. The conflict devolved into a war of attrition, characterized by intermittent campaigns, raids on agricultural territories, and the constant struggle to control minor allied cities. The financial and demographic costs were immense for both sides, preventing either from launching the kind of grand expedition that had defined the war's early stages. Carthage, having permanently lost its nearly invulnerable island fortress at Motia, recognized the urgent need for a new primary strategic base in western Sicily. In 396 BCE, Himilco's administration oversaw the founding of a new city, Lilybaeum, on Cape Boeo, the westernmost point of Sicily. This was not a mere settlement, but a purpose-built fortress, engineered from its inception to be impregnable to the new generation of Hellenistic siegecraft that Dionysius had pioneered. The city was protected by exceptionally thick walls, reportedly up to 10 meters in height, and fronted by a massive dry moat carved from solid rock, measuring 20 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Its harbor was strategically designed with a narrow, difficult-to-navigate entrance protected by submerged reefs, making a naval blockade extremely difficult. The establishment of Lilybaeum was a masterpiece of strategic planning. It secured a permanent, defensible foothold on the Sicilian mainland, became the new administrative and military hub for all Punic territories on the island, and fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, ensuring Carthage's continued presence and setting the stage for the next century of conflict. The protracted stalemate following the plague-ridden siege of Syracuse led to decades of political decay across Greek Sicily. The great city-states, exhausted by constant warfare, fractured internally, giving rise to an era of petty tyrants and endemic civil strife. This power vacuum provided the context for the intervention of Timoleon of Corinth. Arriving in 344 BCE with a token force of only a few hundred mercenaries, Timoleon's mission, sanctioned by Syracuse's mother city, was not one of conquest, but of political restoration. Through a masterful combination of diplomacy and swift military action, he systematically deposed the island's tyrants, most notably expelling Dionysius II from Syracuse and re-established democratic governments. His policy of inviting new Greek colonists to resettle and rebuild the war-torn Polies created a revitalized and unified Hellenic front that directly threatened Carthaginian influence. Perceiving Timoleon's pan-Hellenic revival as an existential threat to its Sicilian eparchy, Carthage responded with overwhelming force. In 341 BCE, it dispatched one of the largest expeditionary armies in its history, reportedly numbering 70,000 men under the command of Hasdrubal and Hamilcar. This force included the Sacred Band of Carthage, an elite heavy infantry unit of 2,500 noble citizens, whose deployment signified the gravity of the campaign. Timoleon, facing this invasion with a small army of roughly 6,000 Greeks, chose not to await a siege, but to seek a decisive battle on his own terms. He intercepted the massive Punic army as it was crossing the Crimisus River in western Sicily. The battle that ensued was a tactical masterpiece. Timoleon attacked while the Carthaginian army was divided by the river, and shrouded in a thick morning fog, his cavalry charged the Punic vanguard, pinning the elite Sacred Band, who had just made the crossing. As the Greek infantry engaged, a sudden violent thunderstorm broke directly in the faces of the Carthaginians. Driving rain and hail blinded them, and the river, swollen by the downpour, turned the battlefield into a quagmire that negated the numerical superiority of the Punic forces. Weighed down by their heavy armour, the Sacred Band was cut to pieces and annihilated, a catastrophic blow to Carthage's aristocracy. The rest of the Carthaginian army panicked and was routed. The victory at the Crimisus was absolute, forcing Carthage to sue for peace and re-establishing the Halicus River as the formal boundary of its territory. Timoleon's campaign had, for a generation, dramatically and unexpectedly reversed the tide of the Sicilian Wars. The era of stability established by Timoleon proved short-lived, giving way to the rise of Agathocles, a ruthless and brilliant new tyrant in Syracuse. By 311 BCE, a renewed war with Carthage had gone disastrously for the Greeks. Agathocles suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Himera River, losing much of his army and being driven back to Syracuse itself. A massive Carthaginian army, commanded by Hamilcar, son of Gisco, established a complete land and sea blockade of the city. With his Sicilian domain lost and his capital under siege, Agathocles faced certain defeat. It was in this desperate situation that he conceived one of the most audacious and strategically innovative plans in ancient military history. Rather than succumbing to a war of attrition, he would abandon the defense of Sicily and carry the war directly to Carthage's homeland. In 310 BCE, Agathocles gathered a fleet of 60 ships and a select force of 14,000 men, a mix of his best Greek soldiers and Gallic mercenaries. In a daring maneuver, his fleet broke through the Carthaginian blockade and sailed directly for North Africa, a theatre of war no foreign power had ever dared to enter. Upon landing on the Cape Bon Peninsula, Agathocles made a dramatic and irreversible decision. He ordered his entire fleet to be burned. This act of calculated desperation eliminated any possibility of retreat, committing his army to a campaign of conquest or annihilation on enemy soil. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The Carthaginian agricultural heartland, the source of the city's immense wealth, had been protected for centuries by naval supremacy and was almost completely unfortified. Agathocles' army marched through this rich territory with impunity, sacking wealthy coastal cities like Tunis and Hadrumetum and seizing vast amounts of plunder. The invasion caused sheer panic within Carthage itself, which had not faced a direct land-based threat in its history. Crucially, the indigenous Libyan and Numidian populations, long subjugated and heavily taxed by Carthage, saw Agathocles as a liberator and rose in rebellion, swelling the ranks of his army. The Carthaginian government was forced to recall Hamilcar and a large portion of its expeditionary force from Sicily to defend the capital. This action immediately lifted the siege of Syracuse. Although Agathocles was eventually defeated in Africa after several years of campaigning, his invasion was a strategic masterpiece. It exposed Carthage's critical vulnerability on its home territory, a lesson that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculations for all of its future enemies, most notably Rome. The death of Agathocles in 289 BCE plunged Greek Sicily back into a state of political fragmentation and civil war, creating a power vacuum that Carthage immediately began to exploit. Punic forces methodically re-established control over western Sicily and, by 278 BCE, had once again brought an army to the gates of Syracuse, placing the city under a tight siege. In this dire situation, the Sicilian Greeks sought a foreign champion, turning to Pyrrhus of Epirus, the renowned Hellenistic king and cousin of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus, already engaged in a difficult war against the rising Roman Republic in southern Italy, saw the Sicilian invitation as a strategic opportunity to create a unified Hellenic kingdom in the west and secure his rear. Arriving in Sicily, he brought with him a professional Macedonian-style army, complete with phalanxes and war elephants, representing the pinnacle of Hellenistic military science. His initial campaign was a stunning success. With the combined forces of the Sicilian Greeks under his command, Pyrrhus swept across the island in 278 and 277 BCE, systematically driving Carthaginian garrisons from their strongholds. He captured the near-impregnable fortress of Eryx and forced the Punic armies into a full retreat, boxing them into their last major bastion, the fortress city of Lilybaeum. However, it was here that his campaign faltered. The formidable defences of Lilybaeum, engineered over a century earlier, proved impervious to Pyrrhus's siege engines and assault tactics. His inability to take the city marked the turning point of the war. Frustrated and bogged down, Pyrrhus's behaviour became increasingly autocratic. He executed prominent Sicilian leaders on suspicion of treason and imposed heavy levies on the Greek cities to fund his war effort. The very cities that had hailed him as a liberator now turned against him, viewing his rule as more oppressive than Carthage's. Facing a widespread revolt from his Greek allies and unable to achieve a decisive victory, Pyrrhus abandoned Sicily in 276 BCE to resume his war in Italy. His intervention, while briefly successful, ultimately served only to inflict crippling losses on all participants. The 3-century-long Greek-Punic Wars for Sicily ended not with a clear victor, but in mutual exhaustion. Both the Greek polis and Carthage were left demographically depleted and financially ruined, their military power shattered. This final inconclusive struggle set the stage for a new conflict, as the power vacuum they created in Sicily would inevitably be filled by the next great Mediterranean power, Rome. The catalyst for the monumental clash between Rome and Carthage was not a calculated act of imperial ambition by either power, but a regional crisis ignited by a rogue band of mercenaries. Following the death of Agathocles, his unemployed Campanian soldiers, who called themselves Mamertines, or Sons of Mars, seized the strategic city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily in 288 BCE. Expelling or killing the male citizens, they established a predatory state, dominating the vital Strait of Messina and funding their existence through piracy and extortion. For nearly 2 decades, their control of this crucial choke point destabilized regional trade. The situation escalated dramatically when Hiero II, the new ruler of Syracuse, mounted a systematic campaign to eradicate the Mamertine threat. In 265 BCE, Hiero decisively defeated them in open battle and laid siege to Messana, bringing the mercenary state to the brink of annihilation. Facing extermination, the cornered Mamertines fractured and sent desperate appeals for aid to the 2 great powers of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage and Rome. Carthage, whose sphere of influence already included most of Sicily, responded first. Seeing a golden opportunity to gain control over the strait, they dispatched a garrison that was admitted into the city, compelling Hiero to withdraw his forces. This Punic occupation of Messana, however, created an intolerable strategic situation for Rome. The prospect of a Carthaginian military presence just a few kilometers from the Italian mainland was a direct threat to the security of the Republic, which had only recently completed its unification of the peninsula. The Roman Senate was deeply divided over the Mamertine Appeal, aiding a disreputable band of pirates and treaty breakers, violated Roman traditions of fides, or good faith. Moreover, intervention would mean a war with Carthage, a naval superpower with whom Rome had maintained treaties for centuries. It would represent Rome's first military campaign outside of Italy, a radical departure from its traditional foreign policy. However, the fear that Carthage would use Messana as a stepping stone for an invasion of Italy, combined with pressure from the popular assembly swayed by promises of wealth and military glory, proved decisive. In 264 BCE, the consul Appius Claudius Caudex led a Roman army across the strait. He persuaded the Mamertines to expel the Carthaginian garrison, and then proceeded to defeat both the Syracusan and hastily assembled Punic forces outside the city. This direct Roman military action in a long-established Carthaginian sphere of influence was the irrevocable act that triggered the First Punic War, a 23-year conflict that would determine the destiny of the Mediterranean. Entering the First Punic War, the Roman Republic faced a crippling strategic disadvantage. As an exclusively land-based power, its military prowess ended at the coastline. Carthage, by contrast, was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, possessing a vast and technologically superior navy built upon centuries of Phoenician maritime experience. Rome's own fleet was negligible, consisting of a few triremes suitable only for coastal patrols and wholly incapable of challenging the massive Carthaginian quinqueremes that dominated the sea lanes. The initial phase of the war in Sicily made this disparity painfully clear. While Roman legions could win victories on land, Carthage could reinforce and resupply its Sicilian strongholds at will, rendering Roman gains temporary and precarious. A breakthrough came from a stroke of fortune in 264 BCE, when a Carthaginian quinquereme ran aground and was captured intact by the Romans. This single vessel provided a technological blueprint that the Republic exploited with astonishing speed and industrial scale. The Roman Senate authorized an unprecedented naval construction program, commissioning the construction of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. According to the historian Polybius, this massive fleet was built in a mere 60 days, a feat achieved through the application of mass production techniques. While the ships were being constructed, crews of rowers, many of whom had never been to sea, were trained on land using large wooden scaffolding that mimicked the rowing benches of a warship. However, the Romans were pragmatic enough to know that simply copying Carthaginian ship design would not be enough to overcome their rivals' vast superiority in seamanship and naval tactics. A direct confrontation based on ramming and maneuverability would still lead to certain defeat. Rome's military strength lay not with its sailors, but with its heavily armed, disciplined legionaries. The solution was a radical and ingenious technological innovation, the corvus, or crow. This device was a heavy boarding bridge, approximately 11 meters long and 1.2 meters wide. Mounted on the prow of each new Roman warship, attached to a large pole and operated by a system of pulleys, the corvus could be swung around and dropped onto the deck of an opposing vessel. At its tip was a heavy, pointed spike, designed to pierce the enemy's deck planks, locking the two ships together. The corvus was a masterstroke of tactical adaptation. It entirely negated the Carthaginian advantage in naval maneuvering. Once an enemy ship was grappled, the bridge created a stable platform for Roman marines to storm across and engage the Punic crew in the close quarters, hand-to-hand combat where Roman legionary tactics and equipment excelled. It transformed a sea battle into a land battle, allowing Rome to bring its greatest military asset to bear in a domain where it should have been weakest. With their innovative new fleet constructed and the corvus installed, the Romans were eager to challenge Carthaginian sea power in 260 BCE. The first test of this nascent navy, however, would serve as a lesson in the difference between technological potential and tactical competence. The command of the advanced squadron, a force of 17 ships, was given to the consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, a respected patrician with a distinguished record in land warfare, but no practical experience in naval command. Driven by a desire for a swift and glorious victory, Scipio's overconfidence proved to be his undoing. Acting on intelligence that the Punic-held town of Lipara in the Aeolian Islands was on the verge of defecting to Rome, he saw an opportunity to secure an easy prize. Without waiting for the main Roman fleet, he rashly sailed his entire squadron directly into Lipara's confined harbour. This imprudent manoeuvre did not go unnoticed. The Carthaginian commander in the region, Hannibal Gisco, was patrolling nearby with a force of 20 experienced ships. Recognizing the tactical blunder, Gisco immediately moved to capitalize on it. He blockaded the narrow entrance to the harbour, trapping the entire Roman squadron with no room to maneuver or deploy their boarding bridges. The ensuing engagement was not a battle, but a rout. The Roman crews, largely composed of inexperienced land-trained rowers, panicked at the sight of the Carthaginian fleet sealing their only escape route. Faced with the certainty of capture and unable to bring their primary weapon, the corvus, to bear in the cramped conditions, Roman morale collapsed. There was no organized resistance. Many of the Roman crews abandoned their ships and attempted to flee inland, only to be rounded up by Carthaginian forces. The rest were captured aboard their vessels with barely a fight. Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio himself was taken prisoner on his flagship, a humiliating end to the Roman navy's first major operation. The loss of all 17 ships without inflicting any significant damage on the enemy was a tactical and psychological disaster for Rome. It seemed to confirm the Carthaginian belief in their own innate naval superiority and the foolishness of a land power challenging them at sea. For his role in the fiasco, Scipio earned the permanent and unflattering cognomen Asina, meaning donkey. Yet, for the resilient Romans, the humiliation at the Lipari Islands was not a deterrent but a harsh lesson, reinforcing the need for cautious leadership and setting the stage for a far more decisive confrontation. Following the debacle at the Lipari Islands, the main Roman fleet, numbering over 100 warships, came under the command of the other consul for 260 BCE, Gaius Duilius. He absorbed the lesson of his colleague's failure. Inexperience and overconfidence were fatal. The Carthaginians, led by the same Hannibal Gisco who had triumphed at Lipara, were now emboldened and contemptuous of Roman naval capabilities. When the two main fleets met off the coast of Mylae in northeastern Sicily, Gisco expected a swift and easy repeat of his earlier success. His fleet of approximately 130 ships advanced on the Romans in a loose, disorganized formation, eager to employ their superior ramming and maneuvering skills against what they perceived to be a clumsy and inept opponent. The Carthaginians were perplexed by the strange contraptions mounted on the bows of the Roman ships, but in their arrogance they failed to recognize their tactical significance. As the lead Punic vessels closed in for the attack, the Romans unleashed their secret weapon. The corvi slammed down onto the decks of Gisco's foremost ships, their heavy spikes biting deep into the planking and locking the vessels together. The Carthaginian crews, masters of open water tactics, were utterly unprepared for what happened next. Heavily armed Roman marines, fighting with the discipline of legionaries, stormed across the boarding bridges. The naval engagement was instantly nullified, transformed into a series of brutal shipboard infantry battles. The skilled Punic sailors were no match for the Roman soldiers in close-quarters combat. The first 30 Carthaginian ships to engage were captured in this manner, their crews overwhelmed before they understood the nature of the Roman strategy. Hannibal Gisco, whose flagship was among this lead group, barely escaped in a small skiff, abandoning his vessel to the Romans. The remaining Carthaginian ships, witnessing the shocking effectiveness of the Corvus, attempted to outflank the Roman line and attack from the sides and rear where the boarding bridges could not be deployed. However, the Romans proved surprisingly adept, turning their ships to meet the threat and successfully grappling another 20 Punic vessels. Utterly demoralized, and with their primary tactical advantage completely neutralized, the rest of the Carthaginian fleet broke off the engagement and fled. The Battle of Mylae was a stunning and decisive victory for Rome. They had lost only a handful of ships while capturing or sinking 50 of Carthage's best quinqueremes. It was the Republic's first major naval triumph, a vindication of their technological innovation and tactical adaptation. The psychological impact was immense, shattering the myth of Carthaginian invincibility at sea. Gaius Duilius was awarded a naval triumph in Rome, the first in the city's history, and a commemorative rostral column, the Columna Rostrata, decorated with the prows of captured Carthaginian ships, was erected in the Forum to celebrate the victory that marked Rome's arrival as a formidable sea power. Buoyed by their naval victories and seeking to bring the war to a decisive conclusion, the Roman Senate authorized a direct invasion of the Carthaginian homeland in 256 BCE. Under the command of consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, a massive Roman fleet defeated the Carthaginians at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, clearing the way for an amphibious landing on the Cape Bon Peninsula. The invasion met with immediate and overwhelming success. Carthage's land forces were unprepared for a direct assault on their home territory, and the Roman army, led by Regulus, marched through the countryside with impunity. They systematically plundered the rich agricultural heartland, capturing the city of Aspis and amassing vast amounts of wealth and over 20,000 slaves. The initial Roman victories created panic within the walls of Carthage. Believing the war to be nearly won, the Senate in Rome made a critical strategic error born from overconfidence. They recalled Vulso and a significant portion of the fleet and army, leaving Regulus with a reduced force of 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry to complete the subjugation of their rival. Regulus, now in sole command, pressed his advantage, defeating a hastily assembled Punic army and advancing to the city of Tunis, within sight of Carthage itself. The terms of peace he offered were so severe, demanding the dismantling of their navy and the payment of a massive indemnity, that the Carthaginians resolved to fight on. In their desperation, Carthage sought foreign expertise, hiring a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus. Upon his arrival, Xanthippus immediately identified the critical flaw in Punic military strategy. The Carthaginian commanders had been ineptly fighting the Romans in hilly terrain, which negated their primary advantages, a superior cavalry and a formidable corps of war elephants. Xanthippus retrained the Carthaginian army, emphasizing the proper deployment of these assets. In 255 BCE, he led the revitalized Punic force to meet Regulus on the open plains near the Bagradus River. He placed his elephants in a single line at the front, supported by a traditional infantry phalanx, and positioned his dominant cavalry on the wings. As the Roman legions advanced in their customary formation, the Carthaginian cavalry swiftly overwhelmed their Roman counterparts and enveloped the legionary flanks. Simultaneously, the line of war elephants charged directly into the Roman infantry, causing mass panic and shattering their disciplined formations. The Carthaginian phalanx then advanced to engage the disordered Romans. The result was the near-total annihilation of the Roman expeditionary force. Regulus himself was captured, and only about 2,000 Roman soldiers managed to escape. The invasion of Africa had ended in a catastrophic failure, demonstrating Carthage's resilience and ensuring the war would grind on for another 14 years. Following the disastrous end of the African expedition and a series of catastrophic Roman naval losses to storms, the First Punic War devolved into a grinding conflict of attrition centered on Sicily. Both republics were financially and demographically exhausted. Rome controlled most of the island but struggled to dislodge the Punic strongholds of Lilybaeum and Drepana, which were sustained by sea. In this stagnant phase of the war, Carthage appointed a new commander in 247 BCE, Hamilcar Barca, father of the future general Hannibal. Hamilcar recognized that with Carthage's depleted treasury and limited manpower, he could not defeat the superior Roman legions in a conventional pitched battle. He therefore adopted a new and frustrating strategy of unconventional warfare. Instead of seeking a decisive engagement, Hamilcar established a fortified base on the almost impregnable Mount Hercte, a mountain near Panormus that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory and possessed its own harbour. From this secure bastion, which Roman forces could not successfully assault, he began a relentless campaign of harassment. His strategy was not to conquer territory, but to bleed the Roman war effort dry. He launched constant, small-scale raids on Roman supply lines and foraging parties, creating a permanent state of insecurity for the legions operating in western Sicily. His highly trained mercenaries would strike quickly and retreat to their mountain fortress before the slower-moving Roman infantry could organize an effective response. Hamilcar's operations were not confined to the island. Utilizing his access to the sea, he conducted daring naval raids against the coast of southern Italy, plundering Roman territory and demonstrating that even the Italian mainland was not safe from Punic attack. These actions served a dual purpose. They acquired much-needed supplies for his army while forcing Rome to divert resources to coastal defense, further straining their military capacity. For 3 years, he tied down significant Roman forces from his base at Hercte, becoming a constant and irresolvable problem for the Roman command. In 244 BCE, in an even bolder move, he abandoned Hercte and established a new base on the slopes of Mount Eryx, placing his army between the Roman forces besieging Drepana and those stationed at Panormus. From this new position, he continued his guerrilla campaign, threatening Roman siege works and intercepting their communications. Hamilcar's brilliant and unorthodox tactics single-handedly revitalized the Carthaginian war effort in Sicily, prolonging the stalemate and demonstrating a strategic flexibility the Romans had not previously encountered. By 242 BCE, after more than 2 decades of conflict, the Roman Republic, though financially broken, resolved to make one final effort to achieve naval supremacy and break the stalemate. The state treasury was empty, so a new fleet of 200 quinqueremes was constructed using funds raised through forced loans from wealthy private citizens. This new fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, was a significant evolution from its predecessors. The ships were lighter, more maneuverable, and built based on the captured vessel of Hannibal the Rhodian, emphasizing speed and traditional ramming tactics over the now abandoned Corvus. Catulus sailed for Sicily, blockading the harbours of Lilybaeum and Drepana, severing Hamilcar Barca's lines of communication and supply. This decisive action forced Carthage's hand. They hastily assembled a relief fleet under an admiral named Hanno, but it was critically unprepared for a major engagement. The ships were undermanned with poorly trained crews and heavily laden with grain and supplies intended for Hamilcar's besieged army. Hanno's plan was to reach Eryx, unload the cargo, take aboard Hamilcar's veteran soldiers as marines, and only then seek battle with the Romans. However, Catulus, having drilled his own crews relentlessly, anticipated this strategy. In March of 241 BCE, he intercepted the encumbered Punic fleet as it sailed near the Aegates Islands. The ensuing battle was a complete tactical mismatch. The agile Roman ships, unburdened by cargo, were far superior to the sluggish, heavily laden Carthaginian vessels. The Roman crews, now well-trained and experienced, systematically outmaneuvered their Punic counterparts. In the decisive engagement, the Romans sank 50 Carthaginian ships and captured another 70, while suffering minimal losses. The Punic relief force was annihilated, and with it, any hope of sustaining Hamilcar's army in Sicily. The defeat at the Aegates Islands was the final, crippling blow. With no fleet to challenge Roman control of the sea and their most effective army completely isolated, the Carthaginian Council of Elders had no alternative but to seek peace. They granted Hamilcar Barca the authority to negotiate the terms. The resulting Treaty of Lutatius was a humiliating capitulation for Carthage. They were forced to cede all claims to Sicily, which became Rome's first overseas province. Furthermore, they had to return all Roman prisoners of war without ransom and, most devastatingly, pay a staggering war indemnity of 3,200 Euboean talents of silver over a period of 10 years. After 23 years of brutal warfare, the First Punic War was over, ending in a decisive Roman victory that stripped Carthage of its wealth and its oldest, most prized colonial territory. The humiliating peace with Rome plunged Carthage into an immediate and even more perilous crisis. The state was bankrupt, unable to pay the vast army of over 20,000 multi-ethnic mercenaries who had served under Hamilcar Barca in Sicily. The Carthaginian government made the disastrous decision to transport the entire army to Africa at once, concentrating a large body of armed, unemployed, and disgruntled soldiers near the capital. When the state attempted to negotiate a reduction in their promised back pay, citing the empty treasury, the simmering resentment erupted into open mutiny. The mercenaries, led by a runaway Campanian slave named Spendius and a Libyan soldier named Matho, seized Tunis and declared war on their former employers. The uprising quickly escalated beyond a simple dispute over wages. Matho and Spendius successfully incited Carthage's oppressed Libyan subjects to join their cause, transforming the mutiny into a full-scale national revolt. The Libyans, resentful of the heavy taxes and tribute exacted by Carthage, flocked to the rebel banner, providing the mercenary army with fresh recruits and crucial financial support. The rebels besieged the loyal cities of Utica and Hippo, effectively cutting Carthage off from its African hinterland and blockading it by land. The initial Carthaginian response, led by Hanno the Great, was incompetent and ineffective, leading to several defeats that emboldened the rebels. Faced with imminent destruction, the Carthaginian government recalled Hamilcar Barca to command. What followed was a conflict of unparalleled brutality, known to history as the Truceless War, because no mercy was shown by either side. Hamilcar, employing the same strategic brilliance he had shown in Sicily, managed to break the siege of Carthage and inflict a series of defeats on the rebel armies. The war was characterized by extreme atrocities. The rebels under Spendius tortured and executed 700 Carthaginian prisoners, including the general Hannibal Gisco by crucifixion. In response, Hamilcar adopted a policy of no quarter, throwing thousands of captured rebels to be trampled by war elephants. The decisive engagement of the war came at a battle known as the Soar, where Hamilcar skillfully trapped the main rebel army under Spendius in a narrow pass. Cut off from all supplies, the mercenaries resorted to cannibalism before their eventual surrender. Hamilcar had Spendius and the other rebel leaders crucified within sight of the walls of Tunis, where Matho's army was besieged. After a final, desperate battle, Matho was captured, and the last remnants of the rebellion were crushed in 238 BCE. The 3-year war had devastated the Carthaginian homeland and revealed a deep internal fragility, but its brutal suppression ultimately consolidated the power of the Barcid military faction. Hamilcar Barca's brutal victory in the mercenary war did more than save the Republic from annihilation. It fundamentally reordered the political landscape of Carthage. The traditional ruling oligarchy, composed of landed aristocrats and conservative merchants, had been thoroughly discredited by its initial incompetence in handling the uprising. Hanno the Great, the primary representative of this faction, was seen as a failure, while Hamilcar was hailed as the savior of the state. This immense popular prestige, combined with the unwavering loyalty of the army he had led to victory, became the foundation for a new political power base centered on his family, the Barcids. This shift created a deep and lasting political schism within the state. The Barcid faction, representing military and expansionist interests, argued that Carthage's survival depended on acquiring new territories and resources to compensate for the loss of Sicily and the crushing Roman indemnity. Their vision was outward-looking, focused on creating a new empire to challenge Roman dominance. In direct opposition stood the aristocratic party led by Hanno, which advocated for a conservative Africa-centric policy. They feared that overseas adventures would be costly, provoke further conflict with Rome, and concentrate excessive power in the hands of popular generals. They preferred to focus on consolidating Carthaginian control over their agricultural holdings in North Africa. Leveraging his unprecedented popular support, Hamilcar bypassed the traditional authority of the aristocratic Council of Elders. In a revolutionary political move, he appealed directly to the People's Assembly to grant him command of an army for an expedition to Hispania, Spain. The Assembly, swayed by his reputation and promises of new wealth, approved his command, effectively giving him an independent mandate that the conservative government could not veto. This act marked the beginning of a Barcid hegemony, where the family's influence allowed them to operate almost as an autonomous power within the state. Once in Hispania, Hamilcar and his successor, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, used a combination of diplomacy and military conquest to carve out a vast new territory. The rich silver mines of the region provided the Barcids with a private source of immense wealth, allowing them to pay their armies, secure the loyalty of their officers, and conduct their own foreign policy with little oversight from Carthage. This Iberian territory became in effect a Barcid semi-state, providing the logistical and financial foundation for their political dominance. For nearly 2 decades, the foreign policy of Carthage was dictated not by its elected magistrates, but by the ambitions of the Barcid family, setting the stage for a renewed and inevitable confrontation with the Roman Republic. In 237 BCE, having secured his independent command from the People's Assembly, Hamilcar Barca landed his army at Gades, the ancient Phoenician colony in southern Iberia. He brought with him his young son Hannibal, whom he famously made swear an oath of eternal enmity towards Rome. Hamilcar's objective was not merely punitive or exploratory. It was a grand strategic project to establish a new imperial territory that would compensate for Carthage's losses in the First Punic War and serve as a base for an eventual war of revenge. For the next 9 years, he waged a relentless series of campaigns, systematically expanding Carthaginian control over the southern and eastern parts of the peninsula. He subjugated powerful Iberian and Celtiberian tribes like the Turdetani, Bastetani, and Oretani through a skillful combination of direct military assault, diplomacy, and strategic alliances, often marrying his daughters to local chieftains to secure their loyalty. Hamilcar's primary goal was the acquisition of tangible resources, and he quickly seized control of the rich silver and copper mines of the Sierra Morena. The exploitation of these mines was transformative for the Barcid enterprise. The vast quantities of silver bullion provided Hamilcar with a private treasury, independent of the state coffers in Carthage. This wealth allowed him to pay off the remaining war indemnity to Rome, fund his large mercenary army, and finance his administration and further conquests without needing approval from his political rivals back home. The mines were worked intensively, using both local labor and prisoners of war, generating a stream of revenue that made the Barcid dominion in Hispania a self-sufficient and immensely profitable venture. To consolidate his gains, Hamilcar founded a new administrative and military capital at Acre-Luc, strategically located on the eastern coast. This fortified city served as his primary base of operations, a secure treasury for the bullion from the mines, and a port for communication with North Africa. The military force he forged in Iberia was a new model army, distinct from the one that had fought in Sicily. He supplemented his corps of Libyan and Numidian veterans by recruiting heavily from the conquered Iberian tribes. These local warriors, known for their ferocity and resilience, were integrated into his command structure, creating a battle-hardened, professional army loyal not to the Carthaginian state, but personally to Hamilcar and the Barcid family. By the time of his death in battle in 228 BCE, Hamilcar had successfully established a powerful, resource-rich Punic province, providing the logistical, financial, and military foundation for the next generation's assault on Rome. Upon Hamilcar's death in 228 BCE, command of the Punic forces in Iberia passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Where Hamilcar had relied primarily on military conquest, Hasdrubal employed a more diplomatic strategy to consolidate and expand the new Carthaginian province. He focused on building a network of alliances with local Iberian chieftains, securing their loyalty through treaties, intermarriage, and by respecting their local autonomy. His most significant achievement was the founding of a new capital, Carthage, known to the Romans as Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. This city, with its magnificent natural harbour and proximity to the silver mines, became the administrative, military, and economic heart of Barcid Iberia. Under his 8-year rule, the Punic territory expanded significantly along the eastern coast, largely through political influence rather than constant warfare. Hasdrubal's success attracted the attention of Rome, which, along with its ally Massalia, modern Marseille, grew concerned about the rapid expansion of Carthaginian power. In 226 BCE, Roman envoys met with Hasdrubal and negotiated the Ebro Treaty. This agreement established the Ebro River as the northern boundary for Carthaginian military expansion in the peninsula. For Carthage, this treaty was a major diplomatic victory. It implicitly recognized their vast conquests south of the river. For Rome, it was a measure to contain Carthaginian influence and protect its own interests and those of its allies in northeastern Iberia. The treaty, however, contained a fatal ambiguity regarding the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally located south of the Ebro, which would later provide the casus belli for the Second Punic War. Hasdrubal's successful administration was cut short in 221 BCE when he was assassinated in his palace at Carthago Nova. The act was one of personal revenge, carried out by a Celtic slave whose chieftain Hasdrubal had previously executed. The death of their commander created an immediate power vacuum, but the army in Hispania did not wait for a decision from the Carthaginian government. The soldiers, fiercely loyal to the Barcid family, gathered on the parade ground and unanimously acclaimed Hamilcar's 26-year-old son Hannibal as their new leader. Hannibal, who had served as a cavalry commander under Hasdrubal, had already earned a reputation for courage and tactical skill. The Carthaginian People's Assembly, presented with the army's fait accompli and recognizing Hannibal's immense popularity, quickly ratified his command. The instrument of Hamilcar's revenge was now in place, and the path to a second, more devastating war with Rome was set. With his command secured in 221 BCE, Hannibal spent 2 years consolidating the Barcid dominion in Iberia, subduing the remaining independent tribes of the Olcades and Carpetani in the interior. These campaigns were not merely for territorial gain, they were a calculated effort to train his army, test his command structure, and secure his rear before turning his attention to the true objective, provoking a new war with Rome on his own terms. The focal point of his strategy became the city of Saguntum. While located south of the Ebro River, and thus technically within the Carthaginian sphere of influence defined by the treaty, the city had formed a formal alliance with Rome. This ambiguous status provided Hannibal with the perfect legal pretext. He engineered a border dispute between Saguntum and the neighbouring Turbalite, a tribe allied with Carthage, and intervened on behalf of his allies, manufacturing a casus belli. In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. This was the final deliberate act of provocation. The siege was a brutal, 8-month-long affair that showcased the formidable military machine Hannibal now commanded. He employed sophisticated siegecraft, including massive siege towers, battering rams, and sappers to undermine the city's walls. Demonstrating the tactical and engineering skills honed during the Barcid conquests, the Saguntines mounted a desperate and heroic defense, fully expecting their Roman allies to intervene. They repeatedly sent envoys to Rome, pleading for assistance, but the Roman Senate, plagued by indecision and political infighting, failed to act decisively. They dispatched embassies to Hannibal, who refused to meet with them, and then to the Senate in Carthage, where the Barcid faction's influence ensured no action would be taken to restrain their general. Left to their fate, the Saguntines were overwhelmed. The city was taken by storm, and Hannibal, making a clear statement of intent, showed no mercy. A significant portion of the adult population was massacred, and the survivors were enslaved. The city's considerable wealth was plundered, with a portion sent back to Carthage to buy political support from the People's Assembly, and the rest distributed among his soldiers to ensure their loyalty for the arduous campaign that lay ahead. The fall of its ally finally forced Rome into action. A final Roman embassy presented the Carthaginian Senate with an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal and his officers, or accept a state of war. When the Carthaginian senators refused to concede, the Roman envoy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, famously gathered his toga and declared that he held within it both peace and war, and they could choose. They told him to choose, and he let fall war. The Second Punic War had begun. Having declared war, Rome's strategy was conventional. One consular army under Publius Cornelius Scipio would confront Hannibal in Iberia, while another under Tiberius Sempronius Longus prepared to invade Africa directly from Sicily. Hannibal, however, opted for a strategy of unprecedented audacity, intending to bypass Rome's naval supremacy and bring the war to the Italian peninsula by land. In the late spring of 218 BCE, he marched from Carthago Nova with a formidable expeditionary force of approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. His initial challenge was forcing a passage through the Pyrenees and subduing the Gallic tribes between the mountains and the Rhone River, a costly preliminary campaign that reduced his numbers but secured his lines of communication. By the time he reached the Rhone, Scipio's army had landed at Massalia, but Hannibal executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, crossing the river upstream with his main force while the elephants were ferried across on massive, specially constructed earth-covered rafts. He successfully evaded the Roman army, which arrived at his crossing point 3 days too late. The subsequent march to and through the Alps remains one of the most remarkable logistical and military feats in history. The 15-day crossing began in late autumn, exposing the army to extreme cold, blizzards, and treacherous icy paths for which his African and Iberian troops were utterly unprepared. Beyond the severe weather, the army faced constant, harrowing ambushes from hostile mountain tribes, such as the Allobroges, who attacked the long, vulnerable column of soldiers and baggage animals as it navigated narrow defiles. The losses were catastrophic. Men and pack animals slipped from icy precipices, while others succumbed to starvation, frostbite, and exhaustion. The war elephants, terrifying in open battle, proved a liability in the high passes, struggling to find footing and consuming vast quantities of forage that was nearly impossible to find. When Hannibal's forces finally descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy, his army was a shadow of the force that had left Iberia. Ancient sources, primarily Polybius, state that he was left with only around 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Nearly all of his elephants had perished. Yet this severely diminished army had achieved complete strategic surprise. The Romans had no contingency for a major enemy force appearing from the north. Hannibal now stood on Italian soil, his veteran army intact, and ready to recruit the disaffected Gallic tribes of Cisalpine Gaul to his cause, before Rome could fully comprehend the strategic disaster that had unfolded. Upon descending into the Po Valley, Hannibal's immediate priority was to rest his battered army and secure alliances with the local Gallic tribes, who were resentful of recent Roman colonization. Publius Cornelius Scipio, having been outmaneuvered at the Rhone, had rushed his legions back to northern Italy by sea and marched to intercept the Carthaginian force. In late November of 218 BCE, the two armies' scouting parties clashed near the Ticinus River. The engagement was primarily a cavalry action, pitting Scipio's Gallic and Roman horsemen against Hannibal's elite Numidian and Iberian cavalry. The result was a swift and decisive Carthaginian victory. Hannibal's superior horsemen executed a classic flanking maneuver, enveloping and routing the Roman cavalry. Scipio himself was severely wounded in the melee and was only saved by the quick action of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus. While a minor battle in terms of numbers, the Battle of the Ticinus was a major psychological blow to Rome and a strategic triumph for Hannibal, as it proved the superiority of his cavalry and prompted thousands of Gauls to abandon Rome and flock to his banner. Following this defeat, the wounded Scipio withdrew his forces to a more defensible position near the Trebia River to await the arrival of his consular colleague, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who was recalled with his army from Sicily. The combined Roman force now significantly outnumbered Hannibal's army. Sempronius, impetuous and eager for glory, was easily provoked into a major engagement. In late December, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to raid the Roman camp, luring Sempronius into ordering his entire army to give chase. The Romans were forced to cross the icy waters of the Trebia River at dawn, on empty stomachs, to attack Hannibal's position. The Carthaginian army, by contrast, was well fed and prepared for battle. As the legions engaged his main line, Hannibal sprang his trap. His war elephants, which had survived the Alpine crossing, charged the Roman flanks, causing panic among their cavalry. More decisively, a force of 2,000 elite infantry and cavalry under the command of his brother Mago, which had been concealed in a wooded ravine during the night, emerged to attack the Roman rear. The legions were now enveloped. Though a contingent of 10,000 Romans managed to punch through the Carthaginian centre and escape to Placentia, the rest of the consular army was annihilated. The Battle of the Trebia was a tactical masterpiece and a devastating defeat for Rome. Hannibal now had undisputed control of Cisalpine Gaul, a secure base of operations, and a growing army of Gallic allies. The path into central Italy lay open. Following the victories in northern Italy, Hannibal crossed the Apennine Mountains in the spring of 217 BCE, choosing a difficult and unexpected route through the treacherous marshes of the Arno River. This 4-day ordeal was devastating for his army. Thousands of his Gallic recruits perished from disease and exhaustion. Pack animals were lost in the mire, and Hannibal himself contracted a severe eye infection, likely ophthalmia, that resulted in the loss of his right eye. However, the move achieved its strategic purpose, placing him in Etruria, south of the main Roman army commanded by the newly elected consul Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius, a populist politician with a reputation for arrogance and a disdain for senatorial authority, was encamped at Aretium. Hannibal, understanding his opponent's temperament, bypassed the Roman position and began to systematically ravage the rich countryside of Etruria, a calculated provocation designed to lure the consul into a hasty and ill-considered pursuit. The strategy worked perfectly. Enraged by the destruction of Roman territory, and ignoring the advice of his military tribunes to wait for his consular colleague, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, Flaminius broke camp and gave chase. Hannibal had already identified the perfect location for an ambush, a narrow road running along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, hemmed in by the water on one side, and a line of steep wooded hills on the other. Under the cover of darkness, he positioned his veteran African and Iberian infantry to block the eastern exit of the defile. Along the slopes of the hills he concealed his Gallic infantry and, farther back, his elite cavalry. On the morning of June 21, 217 BCE, a thick mist rose from the lake, providing perfect cover for his trap. The Roman army, marching in a long disorganized column, entered the defile completely blind to the danger. Once the rear of the Roman column had passed the western entrance, Hannibal gave the signal. Carthaginian trumpets blared from the hills as his forces descended upon the unsuspecting Romans from the front, rear, and flank. The ambush was total and brutally effective. The Romans, trapped in their marching order, had no room to deploy into battle formation. The battle was not a contest of arms, but a systematic slaughter. The Roman army was annihilated. Approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers were killed, including the consul Flaminius, who was cut down by a Gallic horseman. Another 15,000 were taken prisoner. A relief force of 4,000 cavalry sent by Servilius was intercepted and destroyed by Hannibal's cavalry commander Maharbal a few days later. In the space of a few hours, Rome had lost an entire consular army. The road to the city itself now lay virtually undefended. The news of the annihilation at Lake Trasimene plunged Rome into a state of unprecedented crisis and panic. With one consular army destroyed and the other positioned far to the north, Hannibal's route to the city was unobstructed. In response to this existential threat, the Roman Senate set aside the normal consular government and resorted to the ancient constitutional emergency measure of appointing a dictator. The man chosen for this supreme command was Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, an experienced aristocratic statesman of advanced age and a cautious temperament. Fabius made a sober assessment of the military situation and concluded that the Roman Republic could not defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle. He recognized that Hannibal's tactical genius, combined with the clear superiority of his Numidian and Iberian cavalry, gave the Carthaginians an insurmountable advantage in open-field engagements. Consequently, Fabius implemented a radical and deeply un-Roman military doctrine that would become known as the Fabian strategy. He would refuse to engage Hannibal's main army directly under any circumstances. Instead, the Roman army would shadow the Carthaginian force, always keeping to the high ground and occupying strong defensive positions where Hannibal's cavalry advantage was nullified. From these secure encampments, Roman detachments would conduct a war of attrition, harassing Carthaginian foraging parties, attacking isolated units, and systematically cutting off Hannibal's supply lines. The objective was to slowly bleed Hannibal's army, which was operating deep in enemy territory without a reliable supply base, and with no prospect of significant reinforcement, while Rome's own vast manpower reserves could be reconstituted. This strategy was politically perilous, as Hannibal marched south through central Italy and into the fertile plains of Campania. He continued to burn and plunder Roman lands with impunity, a direct challenge to Fabius's authority. The Roman people and many within the Senate viewed Fabius's tactics as cowardly and dishonorable, earning him the derogatory nickname Cunctator, or the Delayer. His own second-in-command, the master of the horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, became his most vocal critic. The situation came to a head when Hannibal's army became temporarily trapped in the Aga Falernus, a valley in Campania. Fabius successfully blocked the only viable mountain pass, but Hannibal escaped by night using a famous stratagem, driving 2,000 oxen with burning torches tied to their horns up a nearby hill. The Roman guards, believing this was the main Carthaginian force, abandoned the pass, allowing Hannibal's army to slip away. This humiliation led the Senate to take the unprecedented step of granting Minucius co-command. Minucius promptly engaged Hannibal and was nearly destroyed, only to be rescued by Fabius. Despite this vindication, Fabius's term expired, and Rome, weary of his strategy, elected new consuls determined to seek a decisive battle. The consular elections of 216 BCE produced Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who, responding to intense political pressure, raised the largest army the Roman Republic had ever fielded, a force of 8 legions, numbering approximately 86,000 men. Their mandate was clear: abandon the delaying tactics of Fabius and achieve a decisive victory. To force their hand, Hannibal marched south and seized the major Roman supply depot at Cannae in Apulia, positioning his smaller veteran army of around 50,000 on a plain perfectly suited for his cavalry. The two massive armies met on August 216 BCE. The Roman consuls, commanding on alternating days, deployed their infantry in a deep, narrow formation, hoping to use their overwhelming numbers to punch through the Carthaginian center. Hannibal's deployment was a work of tactical genius, designed to turn Rome's strength into a fatal weakness. He placed his least reliable troops, the Gallic and Iberian infantry, in the center, arranged in a convex crescent that bulged towards the advancing legions. On their flanks, held back in columns, he positioned his elite, battle-hardened African infantry. His cavalry, the decisive arm of his force, was arrayed on the wings. Hasdrubal commanded the heavy Iberian and Gallic horse on the left wing, opposite the weaker Roman cavalry. while Hannibal commanded the superb Numidian light cavalry on the right, facing the allied horsemen. As the battle began, the Roman legions surged forward, crashing into the Carthaginian centre. As planned, the Gallic and Iberian infantry executed a controlled, fighting withdrawal, slowly giving ground. The crescent formation buckled, inverting into a concave line that drew the Roman infantry deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian formation. As the legions pressed their apparent advantage, their own formation became compressed into a dense, unwieldy mass, unable to maneuver effectively. At this critical moment, Hannibal signalled his flanks. The African infantry, who had not yet been engaged, wheeled inwards and attacked the exposed sides of the now overextended Roman column. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry had shattered the Roman cavalry and circled around the entire battlefield to attack the Roman rear, completing the double envelopment. The Roman army was now completely surrounded. What followed was a methodical slaughter that lasted for hours. By the end of the day, as many as 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, including the consul Paulus, 2 former consuls, 80 senators, and thousands of other Roman elites. The Battle of Cannae remains the quintessential example of a battle of annihilation and the absolute pinnacle of Hannibal's military career. In the wake of the catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry commander Hannibal famously urged an immediate march on Rome, but Hannibal declined. His strategic objective was not the conquest of the city itself, a monumental task for which he lacked the siege equipment and manpower, but rather the systematic dissolution of the Roman Confederation. He believed that the demonstration of Rome's military vulnerability would cause its Italian allies, the Socii, to abandon the Republic and align with him. In the immediate aftermath, this strategy appeared to be working. Several prominent southern Italian peoples, including the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians, defected to the Carthaginian cause. Most significantly, Capua, the second largest and wealthiest city in Italy, renounced its allegiance to Rome and opened its gates to Hannibal, providing him with luxurious winter quarters and a powerful new ally. However, this was the high watermark of Hannibal's political success. The core of Rome's strength, the dense network of Latin colonies in central Italy, and the strategically vital Greek cities of Magna Graecia remained steadfastly loyal. The reasons for this loyalty were deeply embedded in the structure of the Roman system. Generations of shared military service, the extension of varying degrees of Roman citizenship, established trade relationships, and a profound fear of both Punic and Gallic domination proved to be bonds stronger than the shock of military defeat. These allies understood that their security and prosperity were intrinsically linked to the survival of the Roman order. They were not subjects of an empire, but partners in a confederation that had, for centuries, provided stability and mutual benefit. Rome, for its part, demonstrated remarkable resilience. After the initial shock, the Senate, now under the steadying influence of Fabius Maximus, returned to his strategy of attrition with grim determination. They raised new legions, enrolling slaves and criminals, and strictly forbade any public mourning or talk of peace. Roman commanders were given strict orders to avoid Hannibal in a pitched battle at all costs. The war transformed into a slow, grinding contest of sieges and counter-sieges across southern Italy. Hannibal, the master of the open field, found himself trapped in a strategic stalemate. He could not be everywhere at once, and while his army remained invincible in battle, he could not protect all of his new wavering allies simultaneously. As soon as he marched to relieve one besieged city, Roman forces would descend upon another. The failure to shatter the Roman alliance network proved to be the decisive strategic turning point of the Second Punic War in Italy. While Hannibal was achieving his stunning victories in Italy, the Roman Senate correctly identified the strategic center of gravity for the entire conflict, the Barcid dominion in Iberia. This territory was the primary source of the silver that financed the Carthaginian war effort, and the recruiting ground for the elite Iberian and Celtiberian infantry that formed the backbone of Hannibal's army. To win the war, Rome understood it had to sever Hannibal from his base. As early as 218 BCE, a consular army under Publius Cornelius Scipio, accompanied by his brother Gnaeus, was dispatched to Iberia. Although Publius was recalled to Italy to face Hannibal's initial invasion, Gnaeus proceeded, establishing a critical Roman foothold north of the Ebro River. For the next several years, the Scipio brothers executed a brilliant and relentless campaign against Carthaginian forces, commanded by Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal and Mago. Their strategy was threefold: prevent any reinforcements from reaching Hannibal, systematically dismantle the Carthaginian economic infrastructure, and win over the numerous Iberian tribes through a combination of diplomacy and military force. They achieved significant early successes, defeating a Carthaginian fleet at the Ebro River mouth and securing their position. In 215 BCE, they won a major land victory at the Battle of Detossa, a critical engagement that thwarted Hasdrubal Barca's first serious attempt to march to Italy to reinforce his brother. The Scipio's campaigns successfully tied down immense Carthaginian resources. For nearly a decade, they fought a grueling war across the peninsula, capturing key cities like Saguntum and forging alliances with local chieftains who chafed under Punic rule. By doing so, they ensured that Hannibal remained isolated in Italy, unable to receive the men and materials necessary to conduct effective siege warfare or replace his battlefield losses. The war in Iberia was a constant drain on Carthage, forcing it to fight on two fronts and preventing it from concentrating its full power against Rome. However, the tide turned dramatically in 211 BCE. Hasdrubal Barca, having received reinforcements from Africa, managed to coordinate a multi-pronged offensive. The Carthaginian forces succeeded in separating the two Roman armies, which the Scipio brothers had unwisely divided. In two separate engagements in quick succession, both Roman armies were destroyed, and both Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio were killed. This disaster effectively erased years of Roman gains and left their remaining forces penned in a small territory north of the Ebro. Yet, despite the ultimate failure of their campaigns, the Scipio brothers' long war of containment in Iberia had been strategically decisive, providing the critical time for Rome to recover from its defeats in Italy and preventing Hannibal from ever achieving a knockout blow. The catastrophic defeat and death of the Scipio brothers in 211 BCE left the Roman position in Iberia on the verge of total collapse. With their armies shattered, it seemed inevitable that the Carthaginians would consolidate control over the entire peninsula and finally dispatch reinforcements to Hannibal in Italy. In this moment of crisis, a new figure emerged: Publius Cornelius Scipio, the 25-year-old son and nephew of the slain commanders. In an unprecedented move, the Centuriate Assembly voted to grant him proconsular command, an authority he was technically too young and inexperienced to hold. Arriving in Iberia in 210 BCE, Scipio found the remnants of the Roman forces demoralized, but he also identified a critical Punic vulnerability. The three Carthaginian armies, under Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco, were operating independently and were wintering hundreds of miles apart, far from their main administrative centre. Scipio formulated a plan of audacious brilliance. Instead of seeking battle with any of the three Punic armies, which would have been the conventional approach, he decided to strike directly at the heart of Carthaginian power in Iberia, the city of Carthago Nova. Modern Cartagena, the city was the primary Punic naval base, held the main treasury, contained vast arsenals and grain stores, and, most importantly, was where Carthage held hostages from the various Iberian tribes to ensure their loyalty. Leaving a small covering force to distract the Carthaginian commanders, Scipio took the bulk of his army, around 25,000 men, on a grueling forced march south in the spring of 209 BCE, achieving complete strategic surprise. Carthago Nova was situated on a peninsula, protected by the sea on two sides and a lagoon on a third, making it accessible only by a narrow isthmus, and was considered virtually impregnable. Scipio launched a fierce diversionary assault across this isthmus to fix the city's small garrison in place. The true genius of his plan, however, was based on intelligence gathered from local fishermen. Scipio had learned that the lagoon was shallow enough to be waded, and that a noticeable drop in its water level occurred each afternoon. As the main assault on the isthmus raged, he dispatched a hand-picked contingent of 500 legionaries through the receding waters of the lagoon. They approached the city's western wall, found it completely unguarded, scaled it with ease, and fought their way to the main gate, opening it for the main Roman force. The city fell in a single day. The capture of Carthago Nova was a strategic masterstroke. It provided Rome with the Punic war chest, immense military supplies, and a superb harbour. Even more decisively, Scipio's calculated clemency in immediately freeing the Iberian hostages shattered the foundation of Carthaginian alliances in the peninsula, causing numerous tribes to defect to the Roman side and completely reversing the course of the war. The fall of Carthago Nova and Scipio's subsequent victories at Baecula in 208 BCE placed Hasdrubal Barca in an untenable position. With his authority in Iberia crumbling and Roman power growing, he made the fateful decision to execute the plan that had been Carthage's ultimate strategic objective for a decade. He would march to Italy and unite his army with Hannibal's. Evading Scipio's forces, Hasdrubal took his army, including war elephants and Gallic mercenaries, on a much faster and less difficult journey across the Alps than his brothers, arriving in northern Italy in the spring of 207 BCE. The news of a second Carthaginian army on Italian soil sent a wave of terror through Rome, which now faced the prospect of being crushed between two of the Barcid brothers. The Republic responded by dispatching its two consuls. One, Marcus Livius Salinator, was sent north to block Hasdrubal's advance. The other, Gaius Claudius Nero, was tasked with shadowing Hannibal in the south, preventing him from moving north to link up with his brother. The fate of the war hung in the balance, entirely dependent on which side could unite its forces first. The decisive moment came not on the battlefield, but through a stroke of fortune for the Romans. Messengers sent by Hasdrubal to coordinate a rendezvous with Hannibal in Umbria were captured by Nero's patrols. The captured dispatch laid bare the entire Carthaginian plan. Nero immediately understood the existential danger. In a move of staggering audacity and risk, he left a small portion of his army in his camp, with orders to maintain the watchfires and give every appearance of a full consular presence, completely deceiving Hannibal. He then took 7,000 of his elite troops on a week-long non-stop forced march north, covering nearly 250 miles to secretly reinforce Consul Livius's army. Hasdrubal, unaware of this reinforcement, advanced toward the Roman position near the Metaurus River. He only realized he was facing two consular armies, not one, when his scouts reported hearing the trumpet call of a second consul sound in the Roman camp. Knowing he was now outnumbered and trapped, Hasdrubal tried to retreat, but was forced into battle. The engagement was fiercely contested, with Hasdrubal's Spanish veterans holding the center. The battle was decided by Nero. His troops, positioned on the Roman right and unable to engage due to unfavorable terrain, executed a brilliant maneuver, marching behind the entire Roman line to slam into the exposed right flank of Hasdrubal's Gallic troops, causing the entire Carthaginian line to collapse. Hasdrubal, seeing the battle was lost, charged into the Roman lines and was killed. His army was annihilated. Nero marched his men south again with the same incredible speed, and in a final, grim act, had Hasdrubal's severed head thrown into Hannibal's camp. It was only then that Hannibal learned of his brother's defeat, a blow from which his campaign in Italy would never recover. The defeat at the Metaurus in 207 BCE was the strategic death knell for the Carthaginian cause in Italy. Deprived of his brother and the critical reinforcements he represented, Hannibal was forced to abandon any remaining offensive ambitions. His grand strategy, which relied on detaching Rome's allies and forcing a negotiated peace, was now untenable. With Roman manpower recovering and their confidence restored, Hannibal executed a masterful strategic withdrawal, pulling his entire army into the mountainous and rugged terrain of Bruttium, the southernmost region of the Italian peninsula. This territory, with its dense forests and easily defended passes, was ideal for a protracted defensive campaign, but it was also impoverished offering little in the way of supplies or new recruits to replenish his dwindling forces. For the next 4 years, from 207 to 203 BCE, the war in Italy transformed into a grim war of attrition. Rome, having learned its lesson from a decade of catastrophic defeats, now adopted a national strategy of containment. Multiple Roman armies, often numbering more than 10 legions in total across the peninsula, formed a cordon around Bruttium. They did not seek a decisive battle with Hannibal, which they knew they would likely lose. Instead, they engaged in a relentless campaign of skirmishes, raids, and sieges against the few cities still loyal to him. This strategy systematically tightened the net, denying Hannibal's army fodder, food, and freedom of movement. His legendary Numidian cavalry, so decisive on the open plains of Cannae, was largely neutralized in the close quarters warfare of the mountains. Hannibal's once invincible army began a slow, inexorable decay. The core of his veteran troops from Africa and Iberia, the men who had crossed the Alps and shattered legion after legion, was gradually worn down by constant low-level combat, disease, and the simple passage of time. Replacements had to be levied from local Brutian tribes, who, while fierce fighters, lacked the discipline, training, and unwavering loyalty of his original soldiers. Logistical support from Carthage, now preoccupied with Scipio's existential threat in Africa itself, ceased almost entirely. The Punic navy was unable to contest Roman control of the seas, leaving Hannibal completely isolated. By 203 BCE, when the summons for recall finally arrived from the Carthaginian Senate to defend the homeland, the army Hannibal led was but a shadow of its former self, a collection of grizzled veterans and unreliable local levies, whose primary function had devolved from conquering Italy to merely surviving within it. With Iberia secured and Hannibal contained in southern Italy, Publius Cornelius Scipio returned to Rome in 205 BCE and was elected consul. He then proposed a radical and controversial strategy. To end the war, Rome must invade North Africa directly. This plan met fierce resistance in the Senate, led by the aged Fabius Maximus, who argued it was reckless to leave Hannibal on Italian soil while sending Rome's best legions abroad. Despite the opposition, Scipio's immense popularity and a series of brilliant political maneuvers secured him the command and permission to raise a volunteer army. In 204 BCE, he sailed from Sicily and landed a force of approximately 35,000 men on the African coast near Utica, shifting the strategic focus of the war to Carthage's own territory for the first time since the failed expedition of Regulus. Scipio understood that to defeat the Carthaginians in Africa, he needed to neutralize their greatest military asset, the superior Numidian cavalry. Numidia itself was embroiled in a civil war between two powerful kingdoms. Syphax, king of the Massicili, was a formidable and established ally of Carthage. His rival was Massinissa, the young prince of the Massilii, who had been dispossessed of his throne by Syphax and Carthage. Scipio had previously made diplomatic overtures to Massinissa while still in Iberia, and upon landing in Africa, he formalized this alliance. This was arguably the most important strategic move of the entire war. In Massinissa, Scipio gained not only a brilliant cavalry commander with an intimate knowledge of Punic tactics, but also a leader with a legitimate claim to the Numidian throne, which gave Rome a powerful local proxy. The immediate effect of this alliance was transformative. Scipio, now supported by Massinissa's light horsemen, began a campaign to dismantle Carthaginian control over their African hinterland. The decisive engagement came in 203 BCE at the Battle of the Great Plains. Utilizing intelligence provided by Massinissa, Scipio executed a daring night attack on the separate camps of the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Gisco and his ally Syphax, setting their wicker huts ablaze and slaughtering the panicked soldiers as they fled. The battle resulted in the complete destruction of the main Punic and Numidian field armies defending Carthage. The victory was total. Syphax was captured, and Massinissa was installed as the undisputed king of a united Numidia now firmly allied with Rome. Facing imminent disaster and with their homeland defences shattered, the Carthaginian Council of Elders had no choice left but to send for the one man they believed could save them, Hannibal Barca. The summons from the Carthaginian Council of Elders reached Hannibal in Bruttium in 203 BCE, representing the final admission that his Italian campaign, for all its tactical brilliance, had strategically failed. After 15 years on foreign soil, during which he had never been defeated in a major engagement, he was being recalled not as a conqueror, but as a last resort to save a homeland on the brink of collapse. The evacuation itself was a masterful logistical operation. Under the constant threat of Roman naval patrols, Hannibal successfully extracted the remnants of his army, a core of hardened veterans from his original force, supplemented by Italian allies and Brutian levies, and transported them back to Africa, landing at Hadrumetum. He returned to a continent he had not seen since his youth, a landscape now dominated by a Roman proconsul who had systematically dismantled Carthage's African power base. Upon his arrival, Hannibal was faced with the monumental task of forging a new army capable of confronting Scipio's battle-hardened legions. The force at his disposal was dangerously heterogeneous. It combined his own Italian veterans, who were exhausted from years of attrition, with a hastily raised citizen militia from Carthage that lacked any significant combat experience. To this, he added remnants of other Punic armies and mercenaries, creating a force with inconsistent training, equipment, and morale. Critically, his greatest tactical weapon, the Numidian cavalry, was now fighting for the enemy. While he managed to secure the support of some minor Numidian chieftains, the bulk of their elite horsemen were now under the command of Massinissa, riding alongside the Romans. In the opposing camp, Scipio commanded a veteran force, tempered by years of successful campaigning in Iberia and Africa, and now bolstered by the decisive advantage of Massinissa's superior cavalry. Both commanders spent the ensuing months in a period of intense preparation. Scipio drilled his legions in new tactics specifically designed to counter Hannibal's war elephants, while Hannibal worked desperately to train his raw levies and integrate them with his veteran corps. As the two armies maneuvered across the Tunisian plains, a final attempt at a diplomatic solution was made. The two generals, arguably the greatest of their age, met face to face in a conference between their camps. While the accounts speak of mutual admiration, the negotiations were fruitless. Scipio's terms were severe, demanding Carthage cede all foreign territories and pay a massive indemnity. Hannibal, unwilling to accept such a capitulation without a fight, refused. With diplomacy exhausted, the stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation on the plains of Zama. The confrontation at Zama in 202 BCE represented the culmination of the entire 17-year conflict. Hannibal, commanding a larger force but with inferior cavalry and a corps of unreliable troops, deployed his army in three distinct lines. In the vanguard, he placed his contingent of approximately 80 war elephants, intended to serve as a shock weapon to disorganize the Roman infantry. His first line of infantry was composed of Ligurian, Gallic, and Balearic mercenaries. The second consisted of the inexperienced Carthaginian and Libyan citizen levies. Held in reserve, some distance behind the others, was his third and most formidable line, the hardened veterans of his Italian campaigns. His weak cavalry forces were positioned on the flanks. Scipio, anticipating the elephant charge, arranged his legions in an unconventional formation. Instead of the standard staggered checkerboard pattern of the triplex aces, he organized his maniples into columns, creating straight open lanes running from the front to the rear of his army. The gaps were filled with his light infantry, the velites, who were under orders to fall back into the lanes once the elephants charged. On his flanks, he placed his own Roman cavalry under Laelius, and, critically, the superior Numidian cavalry commanded by Massinissa, giving him a decisive advantage in mounted troops for the first time against Hannibal. The battle commenced as Hannibal ordered his elephants forward. Scipio's counter-tactic was executed with perfect discipline. The Roman skirmishers launched a hail of javelins, while the sounding of trumpets and horns created a deafening noise that panicked many of the poorly trained animals. Some elephants veered into Hannibal's own cavalry, causing disruption, while the rest were funneled down the open corridors through the Roman legions. The velites and legionaries harassed them from the sides with pila as they passed harmlessly through to the rear, completely neutralizing Hannibal's primary shock weapon. With the elephant threat negated, the main infantry lines engaged. The first two Carthaginian lines, the mercenaries and citizen levies, fought with surprising tenacity but were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior Roman legionaries and forced back. As they attempted to retreat, they were met by Hannibal's third line of veterans, who, under strict orders, refused to let them pass, forcing them to either break and flee to the wings or be cut down. At this crucial moment, the Roman and Numidian cavalry, having easily routed their Punic counterparts, returned from their pursuit. In a maneuver that mirrored Hannibal's own tactic at Cannae, Laelius and Massinissa wheeled their squadrons around and charged into the rear of Hannibal's veteran line. Encircled and attacked from both the front and back, Hannibal's last reserve, the soldiers who had been invincible for over a decade in Italy, was systematically destroyed. Hannibal himself escaped the slaughter, but his army was annihilated, and with it, Carthage's ability to continue the war. The catastrophic defeat at Zama left the Carthaginian state with no capacity for further military resistance. Recognizing the totality of the disaster, Hannibal Barca himself advised the Council of Elders to accept whatever terms Scipio offered, understanding that any attempt to prolong the conflict would only result in the city's complete destruction. The subsequent peace treaty, finalized in 201 BCE, was not merely punitive, it was a systematic and permanent dismantling of the Carthaginian Empire. The terms were designed to eliminate Carthage as a strategic rival to Rome for all time, reducing it from a Mediterranean superpower to a politically impotent client state. The territorial clauses were absolute and immediate. Carthage was forced to relinquish all of its overseas possessions, officially ceding its vast and lucrative territories in Iberia and forfeiting any claims to the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, and Sicily. Its sovereignty was now geographically confined to its original African hinterland around the city itself. The Punic navy, the foundation of its mercantile and military power for centuries, was to be entirely surrendered. All warships, save for a token force of 10 triremes, ostensibly for policing actions against pirates, were handed over to the Romans, who then publicly burned the entire fleet in a spectacular display of finality. Furthermore, Carthage was forbidden from raising or maintaining war elephants, removing another key component of its military identity. Economically, the treaty was designed to be crippling. A staggering war indemnity of 10,000 silver talents was imposed, a sum so vast it was to be paid in 50 annual installments, ensuring a century of Roman financial leverage over the Punic economy. However, the most strategically devastating terms were political. Carthage was stripped of its right to conduct an independent foreign policy, forbidden from declaring war on any nation without the explicit permission of the Roman Senate. This clause was compounded by the requirement that Carthage recognize the newly unified and greatly expanded Kingdom of Numidia under Rome's ally, Massinissa. This arrangement created a permanent and unsolvable dilemma. Massinissa was now free to encroach upon Carthaginian territory at will, knowing that Carthage could not legally retaliate without Roman consent Rome would strategically withhold. The treaty effectively neutralized Carthage as a military power, dismantled its empire, and engineered a political trap that would ultimately ensure its complete subjugation. In the aftermath of the peace treaty, Hannibal Barca transitioned from supreme military commander to civil servant, being elected to the office of Suffet in 196 BCE. He discovered a state plagued by corruption, where an entrenched oligarchy was embezzling public funds on a massive scale. This corruption made the payment of the crippling Roman war indemnity seem impossible without imposing ruinous taxes upon the general populace. Hannibal's primary target for reform was the Court of 104, a powerful judicial body whose members held their positions for life and were not subject to public accountability. This court had become the enforcement arm of the oligarchy, protecting their financial misdeeds. With the backing of the popular assembly, Hannibal passed a law that transformed the court's membership from a lifelong appointment to a position with term limits, filled by annual election. This single act shattered the legal foundation of the oligarchy's power. Turning his attention to the state's finances, Hannibal conducted a thorough audit of the treasury. He found that vast sums of state revenue were being diverted into the private coffers of the ruling elite. By exposing these practices and implementing strict anti-corruption measures, he was able to recover significant amounts of embezzled money. His fiscal reforms were so effective that he announced to the popular assembly that the Roman indemnity could be paid in full without levying any new extraordinary taxes on the Carthaginian citizens. This achievement made him immensely popular with the common people, but earned him the permanent and unforgiving hatred of the powerful aristocrats whose illicit incomes he had terminated. These displaced oligarchs, unable to challenge Hannibal's popularity at home, sought to eliminate him through external means. They dispatched envoys to the Roman Senate with accusations that Hannibal was plotting a new war against Rome. They claimed he was engaged in secret correspondence with Antiochus III, the ambitious king of the Seleucid Empire, who was seen as the next major threat to Roman hegemony in the Mediterranean. Rome, perpetually wary of Hannibal's genius and harboring deep-seated fear of another conflict, took the accusations seriously. In 195 BCE, a Roman commission arrived in Carthage, ostensibly to mediate a minor dispute, but in reality to demand Hannibal's surrender. Aware that his political enemies in Carthage would gladly hand him over to secure their own positions, Hannibal made his decision. Rather than face a Roman prison or execution, he slipped out of Carthage by night, fleeing into a self-imposed exile from which he would never return. Stripped of its empire and military, Carthage in the 2nd century BCE focused its formidable energies inward, achieving an economic recovery that was as swift as it was unexpected. The fiscal reforms enacted by Hannibal before his exile had created a foundation of sound governance, allowing the state to channel its resources with remarkable efficiency. With their overseas territories gone, the Carthaginians intensified their focus on the agricultural exploitation of their highly fertile North African hinterland, the Chora. Applying scientific principles to agriculture, detailed in the now lost encyclopedic treatises of the agronomist Margot, they cultivated vast olive groves and vineyards, producing surplus goods that found ready markets across the Mediterranean. This agricultural renaissance, combined with a renewed focus on regional trade, rebuilt the city's wealth at a pace that stunned its contemporaries. The success of this recovery was made evident in 191 BCE when, just 10 years into the 50-year indemnity schedule, Carthage offered to pay the entire remaining balance of its war debt to Rome in a single lump sum. The Roman Senate, taken aback by this display of financial solvency, refused the offer, preferring to keep Carthage in a state of prolonged financial subjugation. This incident, however, alerted a faction of conservative Romans to the fact that Carthage was far from broken. The most prominent and relentless voice of this faction was Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder. A veteran of the Second Punic War, Cato harbored an implacable conviction that a prosperous Carthage, regardless of its military status, would always remain an existential threat to Rome. In 153 BCE, Cato was part of a senatorial delegation sent to Carthage to arbitrate a territorial dispute with the Numidian king Massinissa. What he witnessed there, a city bustling with commerce, its harbours filled with merchant ships, and its surrounding lands overflowing with agricultural abundance, solidified his fears. According to historical accounts, Cato returned to Rome and, in a famous piece of political theatre, dropped a fresh Carthaginian fig from the folds of his toga onto the floor of the Senate, remarking on how recently it must have been picked. His point was clear. The enemy was not a distant, weakened state, but a thriving power, a mere 3-day sail from Italy. From that day forward, Cato ended every speech he made in the Senate, regardless of the topic under discussion, with the same unyielding phrase, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I hold that Carthage must be destroyed. This relentless campaign began to sway Roman opinion, laying the ideological groundwork for a final, decisive conflict. The political trap engineered by the Treaty of 201 BCE began to close around Carthage with agonizing slowness. For 50 years, the Roman-allied Numidian king Massinissa engaged in a systematic campaign of territorial encroachment. He would seize Carthaginian agricultural lands, occupy towns, and disrupt trade routes, fully aware that Carthage was legally barred from military retaliation without Roman consent. On each occasion, Carthage would dutifully send delegations to the Roman Senate to plead its case. Rome, in turn, would dispatch commissions to North Africa, which, under the influence of the hardline faction led by Cato, would invariably either rule in favour of their Numidian ally or deliberately delay a verdict, thereby allowing Massiniss's acquisitions to become permanent facts on the ground. This process repeated itself dozens of times, gradually stripping Carthage of its most valuable African territories and strangling its agricultural base. The final provocation occurred in 151 BCE, when Massinissa launched a large-scale seizure of the fertile district of Tusca. After yet another appeal to Rome proved futile, a faction within the Carthaginian government, known as the Democrats, argued that continued adherence to the treaty was tantamount to a slow, passive suicide. Pushing aside the more cautious oligarchs, they authorized the raising of an army of 25,000 men to repel the Numidian invasion. This act of self-defense was the precise breach of the treaty that the war party in Rome had been anticipating for decades. Carthage's army was subsequently defeated by the Numidians, leaving the city militarily weakened and now legally culpable in the eyes of Rome. In 149 BCE, Rome declared war. Carthaginian envoys, dispatched to Rome to avert the conflict, were met with a series of escalating demands designed to render the city defenseless. First, they were told that peace would be granted if they handed over 300 children from their noblest families as hostages. The Carthaginians complied. Next, the Roman consuls, having landed an army of 80,000 men at Utica, demanded that Carthage surrender all of its weapons and military equipment. After agonizing debate, the Carthaginians complied, delivering thousands of catapults, suits of armor, and swords to the Roman camp, believing this was the final price of peace. Only then, with the city disarmed and its children held hostage, did the Romans deliver their final, impossible ultimatum. The people of Carthage were to abandon their city entirely and rebuild a new settlement at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea. For a civilization built on maritime trade, this was not a demand for relocation, but a sentence of cultural and economic death. The ultimatum was designed to be rejected, providing Rome with the final justification for total war. Faced with an ultimatum that meant cultural annihilation, the people of Carthage chose defiance. The Roman envoys were nearly lynched, and the city, which had just been stripped of its arms, transformed into a single, massive workshop for war. Public buildings became forges, temples were converted into armories, and every citizen, from the highest aristocrat to the lowest slave, was mobilized for the singular purpose of rearmament. In an extraordinary display of collective will, the city's population began producing weapons at an astonishing rate. Historical sources claim they manufactured 140 shields, 300 swords, 500 spears, and thousands of catapult bolts each day. The women of Carthage famously cut off their long hair to be woven into sinew for catapult ropes, a testament to the total societal commitment to the final defense. The initial Roman assaults in 149 BCE were met with a ferocity that stunned the consuls, who had expected a swift capitulation. The massive triple-line walls of Carthage, some of the most formidable fortifications in the ancient world, proved impervious to the initial Roman attacks. The first 2 years of the siege devolved into a frustrating stalemate for Rome, marked by incompetent leadership, logistical failures, and costly defeats in minor skirmishes. The Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, organized a successful defense from within the city, while a separate field army, under a general named Hamilcar, harassed Roman supply lines from the countryside. The turning point came in 147 BCE with the arrival of a new Roman commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. He was elected consul despite being underage, a clear sign of Rome's desperation. Scipio immediately restored discipline to the demoralized Roman legions and began a methodical strangulation of the city. His most significant feat of engineering was the construction of a massive mole, a stone causeway built across the mouth of the harbour to completely sever Carthage's sea access. In a final, desperate countermove, the Carthaginians secretly built a new fleet of 50 triremes inside their circular military harbour, the Kothon, and cut a new channel to the sea. This new fleet took the Romans by surprise, but was ultimately defeated in a subsequent naval engagement due to the inexperience of its crews. The final assault began in the spring of 146 BCE. After breaching the main walls, Roman forces became embroiled in a brutal, week-long battle through the city's dense residential quarters, fighting house by house, from rooftop to rooftop. The fighting culminated in a last stand at the citadel of Byrsa, where the final 50,000 survivors eventually surrendered, ending the 3-year siege. The surrender of the Byrsa was not the end of Carthage's agony, but the beginning of its obliteration. The 50,000 men, women, and children who emerged from the citadel, emaciated from starvation and the psychological trauma of the final battle, were systematically rounded up and sold into the Mediterranean slave market, their personal identities erased, and their collective existence terminated. The commander, Hasdrubal the Boetharch, who had surrendered separately, was paraded in Scipio's triumph before being allowed to live out his life in an Italian villa, a symbol of Rome's complete and total victory. Scipio Aemilianus, observing the finality of the destruction, is said by the historian Polybius to have wept, quoting a line from Homer about the fall of Troy and reflecting on the inevitable fate that might one day befall Rome itself. His personal feelings, however, were irrelevant in the face of the Roman Senate's unalterable decree. The orders from Rome were not merely to conquer Carthage, but to expunge it from the world. For 17 days following the end of the fighting, Roman demolition crews worked methodically to level what remained of the city. The great Kothon harbour was filled in, the massive walls were torn down stone by stone, and the temples and public buildings were systematically dismantled. Whatever could not be demolished was put to the torch, and fires raged for more than 10 days, consuming the last vestiges of Punic architecture and reducing 7 centuries of urban history to a layer of ash and rubble. The popular modern story that the Romans then ploughed the land and sowed it with salt to render it permanently barren is a dramatic invention, a myth originating in the 19th century with no basis in any ancient source. The actual process was a far more solemn and, to the Roman mind, more permanent act of damnation. Roman priests performed a formal ritual, the evocatio, calling the gods of Carthage to abandon the city and take up residence in Rome. Following this, the site was officially and ceremonially cursed. A plough was used to symbolically raise the city's foundations, and a solemn proclamation was issued, forbidding anyone, on pain of divine retribution, from ever again building a dwelling on that specific ground. This religious curse, a consecratio, was intended to be an eternal deterrent, ensuring that the Punic capital would never rise again. The physical destruction was complete, but the formal cursing of the soil was meant to guarantee that the ghost of Rome's greatest rival would never return. Despite the Senate's curse, the strategic and economic value of Carthage's location proved too great to ignore indefinitely. The newly cleared territory became Ager Publicus, public land of the Roman state, but for nearly a century, the formal prohibition on resettlement held. The first attempt to break the curse came in 122 BCE, when the reformer Gaius Gracchus established a short-lived colony named Colonia Junonia on the site. But political opposition in Rome and reports of ill omens, such as wolves digging up the boundary markers, led to its swift abandonment. It was not until 44 BCE that Julius Caesar, shortly before his assassination, drew up plans to refound the city, recognizing its potential as a hub for veterans and trade. His successor, Augustus, brought the plan to fruition around 29 BCE, establishing Colonia Julia Concordia Carthago. The new Roman Carthage was built with a methodical grid plan, deliberately ignoring the chaotic layout of its Punic predecessor. It grew at an astonishing pace, quickly becoming the administrative capital of the new province of Africa Proconsularis, and, by the 2nd century CE, one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire, rivaling only Alexandria and Rome itself. Its primary economic function was as a vital nexus in the grain supply, the annona, that fed the population of Rome. The fertile hinterlands, once cultivated by Punic landowners, were reorganized into vast estates that produced the wheat essential for imperial stability. The city also became a major center for the production of African red slipware, a fine quality pottery exported throughout the empire. Culturally, Roman Carthage became a vibrant center of Latin learning and rhetoric, producing figures like the author Apuleius. More significantly, it emerged as a crucible of early Western Christianity. It was the home of influential theologians such as Tertullian, the first major Christian author to write in Latin, and Cyprian, the city's bishop who was martyred in 258 CE. Later, Saint Augustine of Hippo would study and teach in the city, providing detailed accounts of its bustling and, in his view, decadent intellectual life. The Punic identity, however, was not entirely erased. The Punic language continued to be spoken by rural populations for centuries, a fact Augustine himself noted. Roman religious life in the city saw the syncretic fusion of Punic deities with Roman counterparts, most notably the goddess Tanit, who was assimilated into the worship of Juno Caelestis. Perhaps the most telling testament to Punic influence was the Roman Senate's decision, after the city's fall, to preserve and translate the agricultural treatise of the Carthaginian writer Mago, ensuring that the agricultural expertise that had made Carthage wealthy would continue to serve the empire that had destroyed it.